Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunted Bedtime. I know many of you tune in to these stories to help you drift off to sleep. So before you settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. This took place at my mom's boyfriend's house in Phoenix. I was lying on the couch in the living room, talking to my girlfriend on the phone. The living room was connected to the kitchen by a small area that was supposed to be a dining room, but it was always empty except for 2 bar stools at the counter. While I was talking on the couch with the kitchen behind me, I was staring at the wall in front of me. Suddenly, a shadow of a person moved from right to left, startling me enough to turn around quickly. But there was nothing. No one was there. The front and back doors were locked, and the only other person in the house was my older sister, Kelly, who was in the master bedroom talking on the phone to her boyfriend, who was in Nevada for work. I immediately went to ask her if she had come out of the room, but she was still lying in bed talking. She said she hadn't left the room. I brushed it off, thinking I was just seeing things, and went back to the living room to finish my call. After I hung up, I turned off all the lights in the front of the house and went to hang out with my sister in her room. Not long after, Kelly started asking questions. She said it sounded like someone had been picking up the phone somewhere in the house and hanging it up. We were both creeped out. Kelly told her boyfriend she'd call him back and decided to check the phone line. As soon as she hung up, she tried dialing out but kept hearing other numbers being pressed, even though she wasn't dialing them. No matter what she did, we couldn't get a call through, and neither of us had a cell phone. We locked ourselves in the bedroom, trying to figure out what to do. We didn't want to go out the window and felt somewhat safe behind the locked door, but eventually, we knew we had to switch to plan B. I would slowly exit the room, walk down the hallway, and peek around the corner to check the other phone. The only weapon we could find was the metal pipe from an old vacuum cleaner. Kelly unlocked the door slowly, and I crept out. Walking down the hallway, I stopped periodically to listen for any sounds. Hearing nothing, I made it to the end of the hallway and peeked around the corner. There was no one by the front door or the family room. But then, I heard what sounded like hundreds of drips of water hitting the carpet. I turned my head toward the phone and saw a shadowy figure standing there, its hand reaching out toward me. I bolted back to the room, slamming the door shut and locking it in a panic. We didn't know what to do other than try to call the police again. After a few tries, with the phone still dialing extra numbers on its own, we finally got through. When the police arrived, we met them at the front door, running there as fast as we could. They entered the house, turned on the lights, and found the back Arcadia door was open about 5 inches. I had shut and locked that door earlier. The officers stayed with us while we packed up our things to leave and spend the night elsewhere. My mom and her boyfriend were out for the night, staying at a hotel, so we had been house-sitting. I've had other strange experiences in this house. There was one night when we called the cops 3 times because of strange noises and activity. The 3rd time, they even brought a helicopter, but they never found anyone. We were too scared to call a 4th time. So we grabbed our shoes and baseball bats and ran down the street. After about 50 yards, I turned around and saw a man standing in the front yard, just watching us. I didn't stop running. My mother also caught an apparition in a photo. The figure was looking through the window, staring at us. You could see the details: cheekbones, glasses, a goatee, and half a body. I'll post the picture here if I can. This is about my mom, her neighbor's daughter Savannah, and my older sister, Kelly. At the time of this story, Savannah was around 11 or 12, and it happened not too long ago. My mom had recently moved into a new house with her husband in North Phoenix, and after a few months of settling in, they became friends with their next-door neighbors, Savannah's parents. One day, during a casual conversation, Savannah's mom shared some startling information with my mom. Savannah had been telling her that she had people visit her in her room at night, every night. Hearing something like this from a girl who's 11 or 12 hits differently than hearing it from a little kid. and her mom seemed to be seeking advice from mine. I'm not sure what my mom, Linda, told her, but she shared the story with my sister Kelly, who also knew Savannah. When Kelly was over at my mom's house one day, she decided to go next door and talk with Savannah herself. Savannah described the experiences as terrifying, scary people who tried to hurt her when she was falling asleep. One of them was an old man who just stood in the corner, staring at her, while another held her feet down as she lay in bed. Kelly, being bold, went into Savannah's room and spoke directly to the spirits, saying, "If you want to fuck with someone, you fuck with me. You are no longer allowed to be here. If you need somewhere to go, then you come with me." A few days later, Kelly returned to my mom's house. She started describing a vivid dream she had, and her description nearly shocked my mother. In the dream, Kelly saw a man. She detailed his appearance and mentioned that his feet were always in water whenever she saw him. My mom immediately took Kelly back over to Savannah's because Savannah had drawn a picture of one of the spirits that had been bothering her. Savannah had shown my mom the picture the day before, and when Kelly saw it, she was stunned. The man in her dream matched Savannah's drawing exactly. The same jean clothing, reddish eyes, and the most distinguishing feature, his hair, which was styled like a faux hawk. Kelly was successful in getting that spirit away from Savannah, but since then she's had her own encounters with him. She calls him James, a name he's shown her in dreams, though he never speaks it aloud. Outside of her dreams, James makes his presence known in more aggressive ways. He breaks things, moves objects, and has even held Kelly down in bed. His behavior is especially directed toward children, as he growls at them when they're in the house. I've heard the growl myself when I was upstairs alone at Kelly's. I just called him a pussy and carried on with my day. I've had my own run-in with James when he followed me home after I brought my newborn son to Kelly's house. A few days later, weird things started happening at home. My son was being disturbed while he slept, toys turned on by themselves, and lights flickered. I didn't hear the growl, but I called Kelly and told her I thought James had followed me. She agreed, saying her house had been unusually calm lately. Somehow, she convinced him to come back, and sure enough, a few days later, she called me and said, "He's back." She even watched a chair move about an inch on its own right in front of her. Things still happen at Kelly's place, but it's much calmer now. What used to be daily activity is now only every few months. I think James may have found someone else to bother, but comes back to visit here and there. It was the weekend, and my mom and her boyfriend, whom we lived with in Phoenix, were out of town. I had the house to myself, so I invited my friend Dustin over to hang out. We spent the night jamming on our guitars, ordering pizza, and playing Cool Borders 2, my latest video game obsession. While we were engrossed in the game, we started hearing strange noises, bings, bangs, and booms. At first, we brushed it off, thinking it was just the sound effects from the game. We were so caught up in it that we didn't pay much attention. Plus, we'd had a little liquor, though not enough to be drunk. We were 15 after all. After a while, though, the noises became more noticeable. I paused the game and muted the TV, waiting for the sound to happen again. Sure enough, we heard it, a loud bang. I tried to reason with myself. Nah, it's just the fridge. We unpaused the game and kept playing. But then a much louder boom startled us. We jumped up, staring at the laundry room door that led to the garage. Something didn't feel right. I paused the game again and went into the kitchen to investigate. The noises continued, though not as loud, coming from the garage. My first thought was to call the police, but then I hesitated. After all, I was a minor, and the house smelled like booze. Dustin and I stood there, trying to figure out what to do, but then we heard another massive bang, followed by the sound of things being moved in the garage. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my garage making a lot of noise. Can you send someone to check it out? Within minutes, 3 officers arrived. Thankfully, they didn't ask about our ages or the liquor. They searched the entire house, focusing on the garage, but found nothing. They concluded it was probably a cat. I wasn't convinced. Those bangs were too loud for a cat. Unless it was headbutting the walls or having a WWE match with itself, the cat theory didn't make sense. Still, we shrugged it off and went back to playing the game. Not even 30 minutes after the police left, the noises started again. Dustin and I were freaked out. I mentioned the possibility of a ghost, so Dustin called a friend of his, who brought over a Bible. She said a few prayers and left the Bible with us for protection. While she was there, the house was quiet. But as soon as she left, the noises came back, louder and more violent than before. I called the police again, and this time, 5 officers showed up. They did another sweep, even checking the attic, but once again they found nothing. By now, it was nearing midnight. About an hour after the second police visit, I thought things had calmed down. I was wrong. The same loud banging started again. Frustrated, I called the police one last time. This time, they sent 8 officers and a helicopter. The spotlight from the helicopter woke the neighbors, which was pretty embarrassing. After 15 minutes of searching, the police still came up empty-handed. They told us to call if it happened again, but I didn't want to call them back. We had already caused enough trouble. Dustin and I decided to handle things ourselves. Armed with baseball bats, we cautiously approached the garage, ready to confront whatever was making the noise. As we got closer to the door, the banging grew louder and more constant. It sounded like it was getting closer to the door. In a panic, we grabbed our shoes and ran out of the house. We were running down the street when I glanced back and saw a man in 1950s-style mechanic clothing standing in the front yard, staring at us. We didn't stop running. We headed toward our friend Alex's house, figuring it would be a good place to crash for the night. His parents were cool about friends coming over, even late at night. As we got closer, we noticed Alex was sitting outside, wide awake. Turns out he had taken a few hits of acid. Imagine being high on acid, sitting quietly on the side of your house, and suddenly seeing 2 guys running at you with baseball bats. We scared the crap out of him. After calming Alex down, we told him what had happened. He insisted on going back to my house to deal with whoever was inside. We tried to stop him, but he was determined. I remember asking, "What if he kills you first?" Alex, in his acid-fueled state, confidently replied, "Well, then I'll come back to life and kill him." We let him go. Dustin and I stayed behind, not wanting to go anywhere near my house again. After 45 minutes, we started to worry. We peeked down the street, but there was no sign of Alex. Nervous, we decided to go back to the house and find him. As much as I didn't want to return, we had to. When we got to the front yard, we tried to peer through the windows but couldn't see much. We counted down 1, 2, 3, and burst through the front door. Inside, we found Alex, completely unharmed, sitting on the couch, eating our leftover pizza, drinking a mixed drink, and playing the video game. I wanted to kill him. We never saw the man again. And I never had another experience like that in the house. Alex was defriended for about a week, but I took him back. This took place in December 2004 at my sister Kelly's apartment in Mesa, AZ. My family has dealt with the paranormal throughout our lives, but my sister Kelly and I have had the most experiences with it. Kelly had recently broken up with her boyfriend and had been living alone for about a month. Needing company, she invited my girlfriend, Tamra, and me over to hang out. Before we arrived, Kelly had already told me that something strange was going on in her apartment, but she had no idea where it was coming from. She told me that one day she came home from work, put her purse and coat on the kitchen counter as usual, and then ran a bath. Afterward, she went into the kitchen to get a drink, only to find her purse sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor. It wasn't tipped over, nothing had fallen out. It was just sitting there, perfectly upright. This wasn't the only time something like this had happened to her, but it was the first in this apartment. Other small items would mysteriously end up in the middle of the floor too. Things like bowls and glasses, mostly items from the kitchen. So back to that night. We arrived in the late afternoon, hung out outside, smoked, talked, and even played some Dance Dance Revolution. I know we're nerds. Eventually, the conversation shifted to the strange happenings in Kelly's apartment. Tamra was a little freaked out at first, but we managed to get her more excited than scared. So, we decided to turn off all the lights and try to communicate with whatever was in the apartment. For about 30 minutes, we asked questions and made demands, but nothing happened. We turned the lights back on and decided to try a different approach. We took a tube of Kelly's chapstick and placed it on the tile floor in the kitchen, carefully positioning it about an inch away from the grout in both directions. We told whatever was there that, since it liked moving things, it should move the chapstick. We waited in the living room for a while, but nothing happened. While sitting around, I started telling them about a creepy house not too far down the road. The front of the house was wrapped in a screen, and it had 2 lion statues on pedestals out front. Creepy lion statues. One of my friends had the key to the house because she was friends with the realtor, who had told her that 6 people had died in the house since it was built. Intrigued by the story, Kelly and Tamra wanted to learn more, so we hopped on the internet to try to find the house. Unfortunately, since I didn't know the address, we couldn't find anything, not even a mention of the deaths. I decided to drive over to the house to get the address since it was only about 10 minutes away. Before we left, we picked up the chapstick off the floor and placed it back on the counter. We were gone for about 30 minutes. When we got back, all 3 of us headed straight to the bedroom to continue our search. Of course, I glanced at the chapstick to see if it had moved, but it was still sitting on the counter. Tamra asked if we wanted drinks, so she got up and walked out of the room. Not even 2 seconds after she left, we heard her scream. She ran back into the room, yelling, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" She scared the crap out of Kelly and me. We started freaking out, asking her, What happened?" With wide eyes and her hand over her mouth, all she could say was, "Go look." Kelly and I cautiously walked out of the room, looked around the corner into the kitchen, and saw the chapstick lying on the floor, on the exact same tile where we had placed it earlier that night. It was positioned the same way, carefully aligned about an inch away from the grout lines, just like we had measured earlier. At first, I thought Tamra might have moved it as a prank, but then I realized there was no way she could have done that in the 2 seconds she was gone. It had taken me 10 to 15 seconds earlier just to position the tube so it wouldn't roll and would stay perfectly placed. That's when I knew my sister wasn't making up stories about the ghost. I have a few small encounters from my childhood that I thought I would share. All of these experiences happened when I was a child, some as young as 4 or 5 years old. When I was little, I often saw, heard, and did things I couldn't explain. There were many times I would hear my name being called, sometimes from a voice I didn't recognize, and other times from what sounded like my parents. I would go to them, only for them to tell me they hadn't called me. I was too young to understand what was happening, so I wasn't usually frightened by it. But one day, something strange happened that made me realize there was more going on. I was watching cartoons during the day when I suddenly heard my dad's voice in a whisper, calling my name directly into my ear. When I turned around, no one was there. My dad was on the other side of the house at the time, so I knew it couldn't have been him whispering. Even as a small child, I found that incredibly odd. On several occasions, I would hear scratching sounds coming from under my bed. With my ear pressed against the mattress, I could hear what sounded like a single finger or claw scratching slowly at the bottom of my bed. By this point, I was a few years older and old enough to be scared. I tried convincing myself that it might have been a mouse, but the noise was too loud and deliberate, more like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. Another time, when I was about 8 years old, I saw someone I thought was my brother walk into my mother's room. I followed him because I needed to ask him something, and as I entered my mom's room, I saw the figure turn into the master bathroom. I waited for the light to turn on and the door to close, but nothing happened. I asked my mom, who was watching TV on her bed, "Did Matt just come in here?" She said no. Confused, I quickly walked into the bathroom to check, but there was no one there. Not even the window was open. One more encounter happened during the day after I'd gotten home from school. I let our dogs inside to cool off and crawled under the dining table to play with one of them. While sitting there, I suddenly saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I looked and saw the long cord of the wall phone stretched out in mid-air, as if someone was pulling it with 2 fingers. It lasted for just a second or two before the cord dropped back to its normal position. I called out, "Hello?" but there was no response. Now, The next thing I want to share might not be paranormal, but looking back on it, I can't explain why I did these things. When I was small, I used to hurt myself. I don't know why, and while I felt pain, I wasn't bothered by it. I remember one night, sitting alone in my room with a pair of sharp scissors, snipping off pieces of skin from the top of my hand. I still have a small scar on my knuckle, as a reminder. Another time, when I was a bit older, I used a fork to dig into my leg until it bled. I don't know why I did it, and again, I felt the pain, but didn't cry or seem upset. As I grew older and into my teenage years, these experiences stopped. It took me a while to realize that what I had experienced as a child might have been paranormal, but at the time I was too young to understand. I haven't had any experiences like that since. My question is, why is it that children seem to be more sensitive to the unknown, but most of us lose that sensitivity as we grow? And why did I hurt myself like that when I was younger? It was springtime in Sierra Vista, a small town nestled in the mountainous southern desert of Arizona. Sierra Vista is a place steeped in the history of the American Wild West, only a 15-minute drive from Tombstone, where the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral took place. At the time, I was a 24-year-old sergeant in the U.S. Army, temporarily stationed at Fort Huachuca, a key site for military intelligence training. I want to start by saying that I'm a firm skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. My mother, on the other hand, always had stories about ghosts and unexplainable experiences, which I chalked up to overactive imagination. My father was quick to voice his doubts, and that skepticism undoubtedly rubbed off on me. I've always believed that every strange occurrence has a logical explanation. During my 6-week training at Fort Huachuca, I stayed in a lonely hotel room, living out of a duffel bag like many soldiers on temporary duty, or TDY as the military calls it. Despite the transient nature of TDY assignments, you tend to form fast friendships with other soldiers. In just a day or two, the group of us enrolled in the course had become close-knit. As we pushed through the challenges of the training, we helped one another, forming bonds that, though brief, were memorable. As we neared the end of the course, we decided to celebrate at Daisy Mae's, a local steakhouse with a bit of a reputation. Daisy Mae's was said to have once served as a brothel and speakeasy, with rumors swirling about its shady past. Among the legends was the tale of its ghostly patron, a Mexican desperado who had terrorized the area. After getting drunk and mouthing off to a young sheriff, the story goes, the desperado was shot dead in a duel outside the brothel where Daisy Mae's now stands. Our group was captivated by the story. As the waitress shared eerie tales of spurred heels clicking down empty hallways and the smell of cigar smoke lingering in the air long after closing, the room filled with nervous glances and forced smiles. Some of my fellow soldiers even shared their own ghost stories, though they were quickly teased for being gullible. By the end of the meal, a few of us decided to check out the back hallway, where the ghost was said to be most active. The hallway was narrow and dusty, lit only by a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light swayed slightly, casting uneven shadows along the walls adorned with old photographs and relics. A dusty old radio sat on a hutch, tuned to static. As we walked down the hallway, the group slowly thinned until it was just me and my friend Daniel. Perhaps emboldened by a few beers or by the need to prove my skepticism, I started mocking the supposed spirit. Nothing happened. The light kept flickering, the radio kept buzzing, and I felt satisfied that I'd proven my point. But the night was far from over. Later, back in my hotel room, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. My room faced a dark alley between two run-down buildings, with only a single flickering streetlight breaking up the darkness. The drapes hung heavily in front of the window, but every time I glanced at the alley, I felt a deep discomfort. Goosebumps crawled up my arms, and I constantly felt the urge to look over my shoulder. Still, I brushed it off, closed the drapes, and eventually fell into a restless sleep. A couple of hours later, I woke suddenly, unsure of why. Disoriented, I checked the clock. Just 2 hours had passed. As I lay there, a growing sense of dread welled up inside me. Slowly, I turned to look at the window, only to see that the drapes had been pulled open. Moonlight spilled across the floor. My stomach dropped as I glanced out the window and saw a shadowy figure standing beneath the streetlight in the alley. It was amorphous and smoky, but the sense of malevolence radiating from it was unmistakable. Panic overtook me as I watched the figure turn toward my window, as if it had sensed my fear. My heart raced, and I felt utterly helpless, like a trapped animal. The streetlight flickered and then went out, plunging the alley into darkness. When the light finally flickered back on, the figure was gone, but the terror remained. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming pressure, as if something was pinning me to the bed. Though nothing was physically touching me, I could feel a presence looming over me, its breath on my face. The weight was suffocating, and I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It felt like pure hatred was pressing down on me, and I was powerless to stop it. The next thing I knew, my alarm was going off, and it was morning. It took me a while to process what had happened, but to this day I'm still unsure of how to explain it. Was it all a dream, or had I really encountered something beyond my understanding? We're not psychic or mediums, but my parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all have their share of stories. As I grew older, I heard more and more of them. As a kid, I had a few experiences myself, but my parents dismissed them. They didn't want to admit that ghosts might be real, probably to avoid scaring me. Despite their efforts, I still spent years afraid to sleep in my room because I felt something was there. In my teenage years, I found out my mom actually believed in ghosts. I still hold some resentment toward her for not helping me figure out what was in my childhood bedroom. There's a quick side story about my mom I remember from when I was little. One Sunday, I didn't want to sit in Sunday school, so a teacher took me back to the worship hall. With all the pews full, I couldn't see my mom and was getting worried. Then she coughed, and I knew exactly where she was. I recognized the sound. It was distinct, something only she could do. That detail will come into play later. This story, though, isn't about her or my childhood home. My parents divorced when I was around 7, and my dad bought a new house when my brother and I went to live with him. Years later, the whole ordeal began with a dream my aunt had. She saw her father, my grandpa, emerge from a swirl of mist and clearly tell her, "Take your brother Danny to the hospital. He doesn't want to go, but he has to." She was so convinced by the dream that she drove straight to my dad's house and dragged him, protesting all the way, to the doctor. My dad was the kind of person who never changed his mind once it was made up. He also hated hospitals and avoided them at all costs. He believed hospitals made people sicker, not better. But my aunt was persistent, and being the youngest of 6 siblings, he had probably learned it was easier to just go along with what his older siblings said. Dad never took care of himself. His diet was terrible, full of junk food and sugary drinks, and he never exercised. So when the doctors finally saw him, they told him he was just weeks away from having a major heart attack. When my grandma called to tell me he was in the hospital, I wasn't shocked, just upset. It hit me that whether it was now or later, I'd have to face losing my parents someday. Before this, it was hard to talk to my dad on the phone. His speech had become slurred, and it took him a long time to respond to even simple questions. So, when I got the call that he was in the hospital but still alive, I was more surprised that he had made it this far. He didn't live much longer, though. After a week in the hospital, he was discharged and started making lifestyle changes. He seemed better for a while, and I visited him for about a month. He looked healthier, sounded clearer, but a week after I returned home, he had another heart attack and was back in the hospital. I was driving down to see him again when I got the call that he had passed. I don't remember if this happened before or after the funeral. Those 2 months were a blur. But I do know it was a Wednesday. On Wednesdays, Dad used to bring home hot dogs from a nearby place that sold them for 25 cents each. He'd come home with bags of hot dogs and fries. My brother and I, still clinging to that routine, went out to get the hot dogs ourselves, even though Dad wasn't there. We left the front door open, just the screen door locked, to let in the breeze. As we were dividing up the food, we heard footsteps. They were distinct. Dad always wore cowboy boots, and there was a particular 2-note sound to each step. My brother and I looked at each other. We didn't need to say anything. We both recognized the sound. We rushed to the screen door, but the footsteps stopped, and there was no one there. I unlocked the door and stepped outside, but the street was empty. We went back inside and ate in silence. That night, nothing else happened, but the strangeness wasn't over. For weeks after that, the front door would pop open around noon, the time Dad used to leave for work, and again at 6 p.m. when he'd normally come home. The latch would click and the door would open just slightly. Not violently, but enough to notice. I dreaded closing the door at noon, feeling like I was shutting him out. I haven't been back to that house in years. My brother still lives there, and the last time we talked, he said the door still pops open at those times. Animals watching things I can't see, and Donnie, the possessed teddy bear I've mentioned before, telling people to leave my room. Things have been pretty quiet at home. However, my recent experiences haven't been in or near the house. I haven't had any physical contact from spirits, but I've been seeing and sensing them more often. It doesn't really surprise me, considering the women in my family, especially my mother, are sensitive to the spirit world. At first, I wasn't aware that I was starting to notice them. I would be out in public with family or friends, going about my day normally. It took me a while to realize that some of the people I acknowledged weren't actually there. I'd catch a glimpse of someone and turn to watch them, only to find no one there or even nearby. I don't usually make eye contact with people in public, but I keep track of my surroundings, so it's strange I didn't catch on sooner. Things really started to intensify after my mother, grandmother, and I decided to spend a night at the Copper Queen Hotel in Bisbee. It's a bit over an hour away from where I live, but we were excited to see if anything paranormal would happen. I took the elevator up to our room alone, and although the space was big enough for just me, I still felt the need to keep my distance, as if someone else was there. I leaned forward and pressed the button for the second floor, carefully moving my arm as if trying not to bump into someone by the buttons. Later, my mom told me there was the spirit of a bellboy in the elevator, which explained why I felt that way. I asked her if she sensed anything else, and she mentioned a little girl and her mother or nanny on the stairs to the second floor. But nothing more. To be honest, nothing too remarkable happened during our stay. My mom and I joked that my grandmother's constant negativity scared the spirits off, but we still tried to enjoy ourselves. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was uneasy, but I just couldn't settle down. I finally gave up and decided to read a book I'd brought with me. I left our room and found a chair set up near a sofa in the hallway. It was quiet for a while, but soon I felt like someone was watching me. I glanced over to the stairs leading to the third floor. It felt like someone was crouched down, watching me through the banister, though I couldn't actually see anyone. The presence lingered for a while, but I didn't feel threatened, so I continued reading. I thought about who or what was watching me, and I almost felt like it was a little boy, but it didn't quite feel like a child. Later, my mother explained that spirits of children who have been around for a long time don't feel fully like children anymore because they've seen too much, even in the afterlife. The rest of our stay was uneventful, though a man on the third floor wasn't so lucky. His dog ran out barking like crazy and refused to come back inside. After we left the Copper Queen, I began to notice things more clearly. A month or so later, my mom and I were driving through a Home Depot parking lot. I was lost in the music playing on the radio when I glanced out the window and saw an older man wearing a farmer's cap and a faded denim jacket. He was so close to our truck that I thought we were about to hit him. I turned my head to warn my mom, but when I looked again, he wasn't there. I immediately told my mom, and she casually mentioned that he was probably out on his weekend walk for tools. We left it at that. Another time, we pulled into a Circle K parking lot at night, and I saw a man with long, wavy hair in a t-shirt and shorts jogging past the front of our truck. His figure was transparent, almost like a visual echo, and he disappeared as soon as he reached our headlight. Again, I mentioned it to my mom, and she said it was likely a residual spirit. The third major experience happened when we were trying to find a feed store in Benson. We located it, but it was behind a large, abandoned building. As soon as we approached, both of us felt uneasy. My mom stopped the car and said she didn't want to go in. I agreed, and in my mind, I could see a black figure standing in front of one of the boarded-up entrances, watching us. Before I could say anything, My mom put the car in reverse, and we left. She told me that she had also seen someone where I sensed the black figure, but she saw an older man, a farmer type, waiting for customers. We both agreed not to return to that place. Since then, I haven't seen or sensed much. Though it might be because I've been struggling with depression. I'm just starting to come out of it, so maybe things will pick up again. I had just left my boyfriend after a terrifying incident. One day, he tried to choke me against the wall in our apartment. I managed to hit him with a cordless phone, and after the police took him to jail, I packed up my things and called my best friend. My best friend, who had recently gotten married, was planning to move his wife to Arizona. I thought a trip away would do me good, so I packed a few things, stored the rest with my mom, and told him I'd help with the move. My plan was to stay in Arizona for a short while and then return to Michigan. The trip was great. When we arrived, my friend Chad, not his real name, was going to share an apartment with a couple of his old college buddies. I was offered the couch since I wasn't planning to stay long, but just a couple of days into my stay, I became very ill. Later, we found out I had gallbladder problems, and I ended up stuck in Arizona for months, too sick to leave. During one of my better days, I met a guy who took care of me. I stayed at his house when he wasn't on base. He was in the military. But there were a few nights I stayed back at Chad's apartment. One of the roommates, however, was openly hostile toward me. He would yell at me for not cooking or cleaning, even though I was too sick to even get off the couch. His attitude was the reason my boyfriend often picked me up after his shifts at 3 a.m. so I could sleep at his place. The night before I was scheduled for surgery, I stayed at Chad's apartment, waiting for my boyfriend to come pick me up. I decided to stay up and watch TV. That's when I started to get a creepy feeling, like something was watching me. I turned toward the door and saw a small shadow. It didn't make sense. There was no way a shadow could be cast on the door in that spot. I watched as the shadow grew larger and began to slither toward me. It was pitch black, with clawed hands and feet, and its head had dull sockets where eyes should be. It looked right at me and told me to get out. I had no doubt that if I didn't leave, this thing would harm me. Strangely, I felt a surge of defiance and said, "No." Then I called my boyfriend, telling him I wasn't leaving. The next day, I told Chad about what I had seen. I was afraid he'd laugh, but he didn't. Instead, he told me he had seen the same thing before and believed it was attached to the hostile roommate. Chad thought the shadow, what I now think was a demon, felt threatened by me and influenced the roommate's behavior toward me. That day, while the roommate was out, the rest of us blessed the apartment, anointing the doors and windows and putting a blessed cloth under the roommate's pillow. When the roommate came home, he hesitated at the door, almost as if something was holding him back. But once he entered, we noticed an immediate change in him. I stayed the night in the apartment again, and as I looked through the window, I saw the demon clinging to the glass, staring at me with pure anger. I left Arizona not long after that. Years later, the roommate apologized to me. He admitted that he had felt like something evil had attached itself to him. I'm sorry for how long the story is, but it's a terrifying part of my life that I don't want to feel alone in. If anyone tells me their house has a demon, I avoid it at all costs. Though I'm okay with ghosts. Demons are something I never want to face again. It all started when we moved into the townhouse during my freshman year of high school. My parents had just divorced, and my mom bought a 2-story townhouse across from the high school. The place had been vacant for a couple of years before she bought it, and it was the last available unit. Even though it was a new complex, and she was the first owner, I always thought haunted houses were supposed to be old or previously lived in. I was wrong. For the next 7 years, I would be tormented by whatever was in that house. It was during my sophomore year that I first noticed strange things happening. I often felt someone grabbing my legs or feet when I was trying to sleep, which completely freaked me out. One night, a friend was staying over, and she wanted to sneak out to a party her much older boyfriend was throwing. I came up with the bright idea to steal my mom's car for a few hours so we could make an appearance and come straight back. I quietly snuck into my mom's room and grabbed her purse to get the car keys. As soon as I touched the keys, I heard my name called, loud and clear. My friend and I froze in fear, staring at each other. She heard it too. It was a woman's voice, and I immediately thought my mom had woken up. But when I checked, my mom was still asleep downstairs, and my sister was sound asleep upstairs. We had chills but still decided to sneak out. About a year later, I had a vivid and terrifying dream of a demon sitting on my chest, choking me. When I woke up, my knees were drawn to my chest, my arms stretched out, and I was gasping for air. In the dream, a group of old people introduced themselves, telling me they had already passed away. One of them warned me to watch out for my friend Veronica in the coming weeks. That's when the demon appeared out of nowhere and tried to kill me in the dream. The next morning, I found out that Veronica's grandpa had passed away, and she was devastated. I made sure to be there for her. Another major experience happened about a year after that. One of my mom's friends, who was ill, moved in with us temporarily and slept downstairs. I was sleeping in the loft, which was open to the main living area. One night, after I turned off the lights and laid down, I heard her whisper my name. "Hey Kayla, are you awake?" I replied, "No, what's up?" She answered, "I was wondering something," but then the voice stopped. I looked over the loft wall, but no one was there. I quickly turned on the light and still saw no one. Panicking, I ran downstairs to check on her, but she was sound asleep. My mom was also asleep. That was the moment I broke down. The amount of unexplained activity and the fact that it seemed to be targeting me became too much. I woke my mom up crying and told her everything. Strangely, no one else in the house had experienced anything like this. After that, I had several more moments of being pushed or having my hair pulled. Once, I was in the kitchen talking to my mom while putting food in the microwave. Suddenly, something shoved my shoulder forward. My mom saw it happen, and the look on her face was unforgettable. She said there was no way I could have faked it. She begged me to let her call the church and have a priest bless the house. But I refused. I was going to church every Sunday, and I didn't want anyone thinking I was crazy or embarrassing myself. Even though the voices had stopped, which had scared me the most, I told her I'd gotten used to everything else. The last big scary moment happened just before my mom sold the house. I was home alone getting ready for work, blow-drying my hair, when a strong force suddenly pulled my arm, holding the hairdryer, down to my side and held it there for a few seconds. When my arm was released, I ran downstairs in shock. It took all the courage I had to go back upstairs and finish getting ready, but I did. I was tired of being scared and done with being toyed with. I felt so relieved when my mom finally sold the house. That wasn't the end of my paranormal experiences, though. They've continued, and I'll share more in future posts. I'm just curious if anyone else who's lived in that house has had similar activity. My mom did tell me that there was vandalism and a fire in our unit before she bought it, which might explain why it was the last one available. I wonder if that has anything to do with the activity. It's time I share my favorite ghost story. My father was diagnosed with lung disease when I was a freshman in college. It was devastating news. He was one of those rare people, kind, patient, and open-minded. There are 4 of us kids in my family, and I'm the third. My dad and I were always close. He was technical but also very open to new ideas. He was the first person who made me consider the possibility that ghosts might exist. We would talk about anything: telepathy, the afterlife, even aliens. He lived 16 years after his diagnosis, despite the average life expectancy being just 10. As we neared the end, I had 2 important questions for him. I asked, "Dad, can I sing Amazing Grace at your funeral? And after you pass, would you try to contact us? If you're open to it, you and Mom could come up with a word that only the 2 of you know, and after you're gone, try to communicate it to one of us." He immediately agreed to let me sing at his funeral. He had already begun picking out his and making other arrangements. Okay. But he didn't answer the second question about trying to contact us, which surprised me. After all of our deep conversations about life and the unknown, I thought he might be open to it. Still, I respected his silence. Death is an incredibly personal and profound transition, and I didn't want to push him into anything. 2 hours later, my mother called. All she said was, We have a word. I started to cry, just as I am now writing this. My father had simply needed time to think it over. That was on a Sunday in February 1994. He passed away early Tuesday morning. It was a very hard time, made even harder by a blizzard that complicated travel. I did sing at his funeral, and everything went as well as it could during such a difficult time. Exactly a year later, at the exact time of his death, my mother's phone rang in the middle of the night. There was no one on the other end. Meanwhile, my younger brother, 50 miles away in his own home, was working on his computer when his single speaker began to emit sound as if it were coming from all around him. He felt, without a doubt, that it was our dad. Over the years, many other things have happened that we've associated with him, but none of us ever got the word. A couple of years passed, and during that time, I began reading more about energy healing. I practiced it both in person and remotely. Often, my mother would ask me to help heal her friends in New Hampshire while I was in Arizona. She was always a bit hesitant about alternative things, but as long as I called it sending white light, she was comfortable with it. However, after my father passed, I learned more about healing, specifically that loving intent is the most crucial element. We ended our phone call, and I went about my day. Later that afternoon, my mother called again, this time with a brief and precise comment. "Dad is with you." Confused, I asked, "What do you mean?" She replied, "The word is love. Before Dad died, you always called your healing white light. But ever since, it's always included love. Always. He is with you." To this day, I know she's right. My dad is still with me. This year, I finally had the opportunity to go on a tour of historic homes and landmarks in my hometown with a good friend. I'd been wanting to go for years, though I was more interested in the haunted homes tour that takes place in October. Still, this tour was a treat, as many people opened their homes to curious visitors, and some exceptionally old locations owned by the town museum were only open for tours on this one day each year. I am an empath, something I've struggled to accept. I often feel the presence of spirits, sensing their moods, emotions, and occasionally receiving messages. Sometimes I also get impressions of their gender, time period, or projected age. These experiences can be physically overwhelming, which is why I hesitate to join tours like this, even though they fascinate me. There were several homes on the tour, but only a few had any activity. One of the most active locations was the bungalow, now a refurbished coffee house and cafe. The main building of the bungalow is a charming old structure built in the late 1890s or early 1900s. Its history is as varied as its architecture. Originally, it was a private home, and at one point, one of the families living there turned the front room into a private medical practice. Other historic buildings have also been relocated to the property, creating a cozy courtyard. This includes a tiny gazebo that was once a one-room dwelling. Around the front, there's an open-air gazebo supported by repurposed pillars from one of the old Mesa City buildings before it was demolished. Today, the bungalow is a quaint cafe filled with unique nooks and crannies for customers to enjoy. Indie artists and local craftspeople have their work on display for purchase. One of the previous owner's daughters had a love for Alice in Wonderland, which is reflected in the courtyard's paver designs. Colorful top hats, teapots, teacups, and saucers. It gives the place a playful, vintage vibe. The spirits here match that energy. As I walked through with my friend, it felt as though I was moving through a crowd, even though the cafe was only about 40% full, with visitors coming and going. The atmosphere felt alive, filled with laughter and conversation, as if there was a large party going on, both living and dead. It truly felt like a gathering place for both worlds. The courtyard offered some relief from the energy inside. There were pulls from the secondary building and the courtyard itself, though the walled-in gazebo felt spiritually empty. One of the tour guides pointed out a custom-built chimney on the main building, which I hadn't noticed before. It stood out immediately. It was like a beacon of spiritual energy. The brick chimney was built in a unique spiral pattern and topped with an onion-shaped vent cap. Looking at it, it felt as though lines of energy were flowing up its sides and dispersing into every direction. I'm curious to return and see if the positive energy I felt was due to the special occasion of the history tour, or if it's a constant spiritual center. One reason I think this may be a consistent gathering place for spirits is because a yoga studio operated out of the secondary building for a number of years before closing about 5 years ago. As we walked through the former waiting room, which remained intact, it had a calm, positive emptiness, the kind of peaceful energy that invites resolution and acceptance. I found that this kind of energy often attracts spirits. I hope these stories are still holding people's interest. I try to space out sharing my experiences so each gets the attention it deserves. Let me know if these are a good fit, because I have a lot of respect for the support this community provides when it's needed. This year, I had the chance to go on a tour of historic homes and landmarks in my hometown with a good friend. I'd been wanting to go for years, though I was more excited about the Haunted Homes tour in October. Still, this was a treat, as many people open their homes to curious visitors, and some exceptionally old locations belonging to the town museum were only open for tours this one day each year. I'm an empath, and that's something I've had a hard time accepting. I feel the presence of spirits, often their moods, emotions, and occasionally messages. Sometimes I get impressions of their gender, lifetime, or projected age. These encounters affect me physically, and because of that, I often hesitate to join tours like this, even though they fascinate me. There were several homes on the tour, but only a handful had any activity. One of the most active locations was the Serene House. The Serene House, a fully restored 1890s home, is one of the more famous historic properties in Mesa. It's not frequently visited since it's only open for tours once a year during the Historic Homes Tour. For context, here's some information from the Mesa Register of Historic Homes about the Serene House. Built in the spring of 1896, the house was the residence of Joel E. Serene and his wife, Caroline Hannah Simpkins Serene, until about 1905. Joel Serene worked as an engineer for the Mesa Cooperative Milling Company, which was owned by George W. and William L. Serene. Joel E. Serene came to Mesa as a boy in 1878, and his father, George W. Serene, was one of the 4 founding families of Mesa. The house is a prime local example of a vernacular Queen Anne cottage style and exemplifies the 19th century residential development of the Mesa town site. The Serene House was purchased and renovated by the city of Mesa and is part of the Arizona Museum of Natural History. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places on September 11, 1995. This place is tiny inside, with a main sitting room, a bedroom, and a kitchen. There's a porch that would have been screened in, and a couple of outbuildings from when it was a family home. During the annual tours, they spruce up the house with props to help visitors imagine what it was like when it was lived in. As soon as I stepped inside, I had the distinct feeling of being watched. For many people, that might seem creepy, but I tend to feel the emotions behind the watching. This time, it wasn't unnerving. It felt more like the spirits of the house had withdrawn a few levels away, observing from a distance, like children watching an ant farm. I knew the spirits were there because I felt a knot form in my chest at my collarbone, and heat rose around my face and neck, signs of spiritual activity around me. Thankfully, they didn't seem threatened or threatening. I was able to enjoy the tour, especially when I found out why the spirits might be content to stay. The gentleman in the front room, who was there to provide information, explained that while the furniture wasn't original to the house, it was period appropriate. He also described how, during restoration, they had carefully stripped the paint and wallpaper down to the earliest layers. Custom paper and paint companies had then replicated the exact shades and patterns that originally decorated the house. There was even an original wedding photo of Joel and Caroline on the wall, donated by their descendants. The positive energy from that photo seemed to shape the spirit atmosphere of the house. The kitchen, though tiny and crowded, had the most activity, likely because of the items displayed there that once belonged to the Serene family. One of those items was a storage bin designed and built by Joel Serene himself, along with several small glass containers found on the property. Other items in the kitchen were just props, but they were luxuries from that period. I was surprised to feel a great sense of pride around these items. The representative mentioned that the Serenes wouldn't have been able to afford such expensive things, so I didn't think the pride came from them. But the feeling was on the same wavelength, which usually indicates emotions from the same spirit or group of spirits. I like to think Caroline or another spirit was pleased to have such fancy things in the home, even if they didn't own them in life. If I had to sum up the spirit energy in the Serene house, I would say it felt like the spirits were quietly sitting back while their home filled with visitors, knowing that once the day was over, they would enjoy another year of peaceful solitude with only the building keepers for company. Mesa AZ, Historic Homes Tour, January 2015. I've included this intro to preface stories from each of the active locations on the tour. This year, I finally had the opportunity to go on a tour of historic homes and landmarks in my hometown with a good friend. I had been wanting to go for years, though this tour was second to the Haunted Homes Tour that happens in October. Still, it was a real treat. Many people were kind enough to open their homes to visitors, and some of the exceptionally old locations owned by the town museum were only available for tours on this one day each year. I am an empath, something I've struggled to accept. I often feel the presence of spirits, sensing their moods, emotions, and occasionally even receiving messages. Rarely, I get impressions of their gender, lifetime, or projected age. These encounters affect me physically, which is why I sometimes hesitate to join tours like this, even though they fascinate me. There were several homes on the tour, but only a few had any noticeable activity. This is one of the active locations. Cozy Personal Home, address omitted for privacy. One of the best parts of historic home tours is that owners of private residences open their living spaces to visitors. My friend was especially excited about this particular house. Some of the homes on the tour had been completely renovated with modern interiors, which I'm not a huge fan of. But this home had a cluttered coziness that made it feel warm and inviting. It was the kind of place where artistic people live, a cozy nest full of interesting things to look at. With just 5 people in the living room, it already felt crowded. Every corner and shelf was filled with books, art pieces, soft lighting, and little collectibles. Though it wasn't haunted, there was a framed golden ticket and a first edition copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in a gilded shadow box on a shelf, among other nifty treasures scattered around. Despite its small size, the house didn't feel inadequate for family life. I was so absorbed in looking around that I didn't initially notice any energy. That's a good sign of how calm the location was. It didn't assert itself right away. Or it could have been that the sheer number of people squeezing through the narrow hallways distracted me. Now that I think about it, that's probably more likely. As we made our way into the back living area, I was struck by something that pulled my gaze in the opposite direction of where everyone else was stepping down into the main living room. To the left, there was a cozy space with plush seating, but to the right, on a raised platform of polished wooden planks, was a small reading nook. It was filled with overstuffed chairs, crammed bookshelves, and soft lamps that arched over the backs of the chairs. A window behind the nook looked out into the yard. I loved the spot immediately. It was warm, inviting, and beautiful, yet it didn't feel entirely welcoming. The chairs felt taken. The space felt occupied. I didn't feel like I could just sit down and relax. That's when I noticed the difference in the floor levels. The wooden dais was just a few inches higher than the tiled floor. Trying not to draw attention to myself, which would have been difficult to explain, I stepped on and off the wooden floor a few times. On the wood, I felt energy and presence, but on the tile, there was much less. I rejoined my friend, who had bumped into someone she knew. As they talked, I learned that this gentleman had led the Haunted Homes tour a few years back. My friend had written a large article on the tour, and he was happy to share more history about this house when she asked. To my surprise, this home had been part of the Haunted Homes tour. The wooden floor, which felt so active to me, was actually part of the original house. The step down to the tile marked where an addition had been built. He also mentioned that the current owners frequently heard footsteps in the narrow hallway, the crowded one I mentioned earlier, every night around 10 p.m., but only if they were still awake. If they went to bed before 10, they never heard it. This was all news to me, as I had never been in this home before. I had no idea it was on the Haunted Homes tour, but it didn't change the way I felt about that corner of the original home. If I lived there and had such a fantastic reading nook, I'd be a little annoyed that I had to share it with a spirit who seemed just as enchanted with the space. This year, I had the chance to go on a tour of historic homes and landmarks in my hometown with a good friend. I had been wanting to go for years, though this tour was second to the Haunted Homes tour held in October. Still, it was a treat. Many people opened their homes to visitors, and a few exceptionally old locations owned by the town museum were only open for tours on this one day each year. I'm an empath, which is something I've struggled to accept. I can feel the presence of spirits, sensing their moods, emotions, and occasionally their messages. Rarely, I also get impressions of their gender, lifetime, or projected age. These encounters affect me physically, which is why I often hesitate to join tours like this, despite my interest. There were several homes on the tour, but only a handful had any noticeable activity. This one, however, was different. Portal Home, address omitted for privacy. Most of the homes on the tour, especially those still in use as private residences, had been gutted and rebuilt inside. This particular home, located just a few hundred yards off a main street on a quiet residential road, wasn't entirely modernized, but it felt different from the others. As my friend and I approached the house with the rest of the tour group, I immediately felt a sense of concern. The front door seemed almost hot, like the heat from a campfire as you get too close. At the same time, I felt a strong, unpleasant pull in the center of my chest, drawing me toward the door. I wasn't sure what to expect when I crossed the threshold. Maybe I thought the pull would ease, or that a specific spirit would manifest. But whatever I was expecting, it wasn't what I felt. Inside, the sensation only intensified. Every door, every archway, and every window seemed to have that same magnetic pull as the front door. It was overwhelming, almost nauseating. I didn't want to stay, but my friend, who is older than me and highly skeptical, doesn't know that I'm sensitive to spirits. Rather than risk her disbelief or mockery, I tried to push through and keep quiet. The only clear spirit I felt was that of a young boy sitting on the stairs immediately inside the front door, to the right. He was about 6 steps up, holding the rail, though the stairs were roped off to keep the tour members from going upstairs. The boy felt around 10 or 11 years old, with messy brown hair parted down the middle. I didn't actually see him, but I felt his presence clearly. For me, spirit impressions are more like feelings than actual sightings. The energy in the house must have heightened my senses, because these details were much clearer than usual. Beyond the front area, things became even more uncomfortable. I wanted to focus on individual spirits, but the energy swirling around the doors and windows was too intense. It felt like every door was pulling in, pushing out, or spinning energy. I've always avoided places with known portal activity because I guessed it would make me feel motion sick. This experience confirmed that. I got a brief reprieve when we stepped outside into the backyard, but we had to walk back through the house to leave. I'm certain I would have thrown up if I hadn't had that break. I don't know what caused the house to feel so charged. Whether it had been that way for years, if renovations stirred things up, or if people had been meddling with spirit energy. But it was definitely some kind of portal activity. My friend still doesn't know what was going on, though she was curious why I almost got sick all over the expensive floors. I've waited longer than usual to write about this experience. I don't typically go looking for paranormal encounters, but after moving back home from out of state, I wanted to see what spirit hotspots were nearby. Museums have always intrigued me because I tend to get interesting impressions when I touch old objects. So I decided to visit the local natural history museum with a friend. I told her we were going just for fun, as I don't usually talk about the things I feel or see. We enjoyed looking at the mounted dinosaur displays, the interactive games for kids, and other exhibits. One particular display caught my attention: a large, fossilized femur from a massive plant-eating dinosaur, sitting on a low stand. It was one of the few actual fossils in the museum, as most were fiberglass castings. A sign next to the fossil encouraged visitors to touch it, and it was positioned low enough for children to easily feel its stone surface. I decided to give it a try, half hoping to feel some dinosaur spirit energy. What I felt was far from pleasant. At first, it was calm and curious, but the longer I touched the fossil, the more I became aware of its role in the dinosaur's body. I had mental impressions of muscle tissue, cartilage, blood vessels, and a throbbing pressure. It made me feel nauseous and dizzy for several minutes after I let go. I wouldn't touch it again. It felt like if I had held it any longer, I might have experienced the creature's death and decay, something that would have definitely made me vomit. Since the museum is in Mesa, Arizona, the Old West portion of the exhibits is a big draw. Mesa was a frontier town, not as wild as Tucson, but still on the edges of civilization for a long time. The museum is built on the site of the old town hall, and there are plenty of displays about life in the Old West. My friend and I explored the lower floor of the museum, checking out exhibits on Native American life, frontier law, and gold miners. She has claustrophobia, so I went through a cave-like display on my own, learning about the Lost Dutchman mine, one of Arizona's local mystery treasures. Nothing unusual happened there. However, when I met up with my friend at the end of the tunnel, we came across something I wasn't expecting: 2 old iron jail cells. I hadn't known they were part of the museum. At first, I was just as excited as the kids playing in and out of the open cell like it was a playground. I told my friend I was going to go inside and asked her to take a picture. But as soon as I stepped toward the cell, my stomach twisted into knots. My head spun, my heart raced, and I was overwhelmed with emotions. Anger, hopelessness, pain, mixed with a strange combination of shame and pride. It hit me like a punch to the chest. The cells seemed to deepen into a dark, endless tunnel with no light at the end. I had the sudden urge to pull the kids out, shocked they couldn't sense the danger I was feeling. No one else seemed to notice anything strange, but my friend later told me I had turned white as a sheet. All I could manage to say was, "No, I need out, right now." I don't remember what I said exactly, but that's what she told me afterward. We quickly left the area and stepped into a connecting courtyard with more dinosaur displays. The moment we were away from the cells, the pressure lifted, my color returned, and I felt normal again. I was so shaken that I refused to go back through that part of the museum. Fortunately, the layout of the museum forms a circle, so we were able to exit without passing the cells again. That experience made me question why I seek out museums for these kinds of encounters, and I didn't look for spirit activity for a few years after that. Interestingly, when I went on a home tour recently, the guide for the haunted museum tour mentioned the jail cells were one of the most active spots. I did some research and found out that these cells are regularly reported as a source of paranormal activity. I wasn't surprised, but I was shocked I hadn't heard about it before my visit. I'm an Arizona native. My parents moved here in the early 1970s, bought an acre of land in the West Valley, and my dad built our house with the help of family and friends. We're the only family to have ever lived in the house, and I have no idea what was there before. But in Arizona, if something's haunted, it's often rumored to be built on an Indian burial ground. I come from a big family, 11 children in total, and at least 4 of us, plus my mom, have experienced unexplainable things in that house. I'll start with something my mom told me. She was a stay-at-home mom, and one day, while most of us were at school, she was upstairs doing some things. There are 2 rooms connected by a doorway with a curtain instead of a door. My mom was in the first room when she felt a strong presence in the other room. She was so sure someone was there that she expected to see someone when she moved the curtain. But when she pulled it back, no one was there. One of my older sisters, B, I'm number 9 of the 11 kids, slept in that room. As a teenager, she often heard someone calling her name, though no one was there. After she left for college, my younger sister, R, took over the room. She had things go missing and then turn up in places where she had already looked. B also had another strange experience. She attended early morning church classes, so she was usually the first one up in the morning. We had a blow dryer that would click after it was used. One morning, while getting ready for school, she heard the blow dryer clicking like it had been used. She also heard the front door open and close, but when she checked, it was locked, and she was still the only one awake. When I was in college, I had early morning classes too. One morning, I finished getting ready early, so I laid back down to rest before leaving. As I was lying there, I felt something walking on my bed, like a cat. We did have a cat, but it wasn't in my room at the time. I couldn't explain it, especially since we hadn't had indoor pets before that. Since then, our first indoor cat, Spook, passed away, and we've had other indoor animals. My mom has felt the same thing, something walking on the bed, just like I did. When Spook wanted to come inside, he'd jump onto the kitchen window ledge and bat at the screen. To this day, my mom still hears something batting at the screen every now and then. I'm now married with a family of my own. My mom watches my kids while I work, and for a time, we lived in the house while my husband was finishing his schooling. We had our own experiences while living there. My sister T often tells me she feels like something is watching her from the living room. My kids have pointed into the living room and said, "Ghost." I felt the sensation of being watched from the living room too. When we lived in the house, I started feeling a presence in the bedroom. At the time, I had 3 kids, and my middle child was 2. We had a bedtime routine where I'd sing her 3 songs and pray with her. I always felt like someone or something was standing at the front of the room, just watching us. The room we were in had been my grandma's, but I didn't feel like it was her. This presence felt different. I dealt with it for a few weeks before finally asking my husband to bless the room and make it go away. In our religion, anyone can cast out spirits in Christ's name, so he did. The feeling didn't go away immediately, but after a week or 2, I realized it was gone, and I felt so relieved. We've had other strange experiences too. One day, our back porch was mysteriously swept. When she was alive, Grandma took great care of that porch, sweeping it daily. We often heard footsteps upstairs, and things would disappear only to reappear in strange places. Once, my biology test outline disappeared, and we never found it again. We all agree that there's probably a ghost cat or 2 in the house. Most of the time, the presence feels non-threatening. I've been told to try talking to it or to see if we could get EVP, but that scares me too much. I've been with my boyfriend for almost 2 years now, and I need to share something that has been weighing on me. Occasionally, he experiences these intense bouts of rage where he gets angry for no apparent reason. It's never been directed at me physically, but we've had our share of screaming matches. His anger isn't always about me. It could be about a coworker, a task, or even a relative. He's been evaluated for mental illness twice, and both times he was found sane. When he's not angry, he's an incredible person, funny, hardworking, and very loving. He had a tough childhood. His mom was only 17 when she had him, and his biological father wasn't around much. My boyfriend spent a lot of time with his grandparents, and eventually moved in with them full-time after his mother lost custody of him and his 2 half-sisters. His mother had a string of abusive boyfriends, some of whom were especially cruel to him. One day, when he was playing with his dinosaurs in his grandparents' backyard, he looked up and saw a figure on the roof. The figure jumped down and introduced itself as Kenneth. It was entirely white except for 2 black holes where its eyes should have been, and instead of hands, it had claws. My boyfriend says Kenneth has been with him ever since, and we both believe that Kenneth is the source of his unexplained anger. We've even seen Kenneth show up in pictures sometimes, though he usually disappears from the photo after a week or so. When we first started dating, I was living in a spare room at my uncle's house. During an argument, I told my boyfriend that I didn't believe Kenneth was real, and I thought he was making it up. He gave me a dark smile, and right then, a glass ashtray on my uncle's patio split into 3 pieces, right in front of us. It didn't fall, and nothing was thrown at it. It just broke, starting from the center like a peace sign with a missing leg. I was in complete shock. 5 months ago, we welcomed our daughter into the world, and she means everything to us. Last night, my boyfriend was off work. He works graveyard shifts at a convenience store, and was getting upset while playing a computer game. I told him, if Kenneth is real, then he needs to leave. We can't have him around now that we have a daughter. My boyfriend agreed, saying, I know, it worries me too. Right after that, the dishes I had drying on the rack flew across the room and hit the wall. We had a clear view of the whole thing, and we live in a studio apartment, so there's no way to explain what happened. Later, my boyfriend had to run to his store to give a coworker a key, and while he was gone, the shower kept turning on and off by itself. I tried to ignore it, but it unnerved me. We don't know much about Kenneth. Sometimes he gives my boyfriend warnings, like, "It's going to be hot today, don't stay out long," or "You won't want to go down that alley." Despite these warnings, I think Kenneth is an evil entity. He claims to be older than the earth, but I don't believe him. He also says he's here to help, and that he's neither good nor evil, but I think those are lies too. Kenneth claims to be all-knowing, but I doubt that as well. The only thing I do believe is when he says he's never lived before. I'm Native American and live in Arizona, so I've smudged our apartment several times to try to cleanse the space, but Kenneth still lingers. I believe in European magic as well, and I'm open to all kinds of advice. What matters most to me is protecting our daughter. I want Kenneth gone for good. For our 15th wedding anniversary, my husband and I wanted to do something different, something more exciting than the typical romantic weekend at a beach. This time, we decided to be adventurous and rent a room in a haunted hotel. The Copper Queen Hotel in Bisbee, AZ stood out to us more than any of the other options in town. We made a reservation for April 18th, 2015, and were given room number 217 on the second floor. I brought along a digital recorder, hoping to catch something unusual during our stay. That night, we left the room a couple of times, once for dinner and again for some drinks just around the corner from the hotel. Each time we left, I made sure to leave the digital recorder on to see if it would pick up anything. Every time I checked, though, there was nothing but the sound of us talking as we came in and out of the room. Around 1 a.m., my husband and I returned to our room, ready to go to bed. I set the recorder on again before we got into bed, but I found it hard to fall asleep. I was restless, and my husband noticed I looked uneasy. He started joking about the ghosts and spirits we had heard about from other guests. One story was about Billy, a little boy who supposedly roamed the hotel. Another was about a man smoking a cigar. One lady even told us that she and her family had heard screams and scratching noises on the walls the night before. Despite my husband's jokes, I couldn't relax, and I wouldn't let him fall asleep before me. After what felt like ages, I finally gave in and fell asleep. I don't know how long I slept, but at some point, something grabbed me by the foot and yanked me so hard that I had to grab the bed to stop myself from being pulled off. I was terrified and confused. I wrapped myself in the bed sheets, pulled the blankets over my head, and spent the rest of the night trying and failing to sleep. The next morning, I got up and checked the recordings from the night before. At first, there was just the sound of us talking. But as soon as my husband started jokingly naming the ghosts we had heard about, the recording picked up static and noise. For about an hour and a half, there was nothing but interference. I listened carefully and could make out soft voices in the background, but it was too difficult to understand what they were saying through all the static. Once we got back home to Yuma, I wanted to make sure the recorder wasn't malfunctioning, so I left it on as a test. To my surprise, it worked perfectly. No static, no interference. That's when I became convinced that whatever grabbed me by the foot was real, and that it had enough energy to affect both me and the digital recording. I'm not a computer expert, so I'll definitely be looking for help to analyze the noises picked up by our recorder. But I am certain now that something paranormal happened that night. My mom, a single parent who doesn't earn much, was overjoyed when she could finally afford a new house for the three of us. Moving in, we noticed a few odd things right away. My younger sister's bedroom, for example, had 4 different locks on the inside of the door and glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. It must have been a little kid's room before, but why would a child need so many locks inside their room? It felt sad and unsettling. Then we found a pair of real police handcuffs on a pantry shelf. An unusual place to keep something like that next to the breakfast cereal. Still, I was almost 20 and had never lived in a real house before, just a series of crummy apartments, so I was excited about this fresh start. Things went smoothly for a few years. Then, one night during dinner, I decided to share something that had been bothering me for a while. I sometimes get this strange feeling before someone dies, like I can't savor their presence enough. Even if I don't know the person well, I start to focus on them, feeling an overwhelming need to absorb as much of their essence as possible before they're gone. Within days of these feelings, the person often dies, sometimes from a heart attack, an overdose, or an accident. It's creepy, I know. This time, though, the feeling wasn't about a person. It was about our peace as a family. I had the sense that something big was coming, and I wasn't wrong. Not long after, my mom received a death threat from her ex-boyfriend. He's a true sociopath, a terrifying figure from my childhood who we thought was finally out of our lives. My mom had warned me several times that he was literally possessed. Despite everything, she has a soft heart. So, when his elderly mother asked for help arranging her living will, my mom, against her better judgment, agreed. Her ex took this as an attempt to steal his inheritance and made a violent threat against her. That's when I believe he cursed our home. We had to get a restraining order, buy a new car so he wouldn't recognize it, and even ask one of my strong friends to act as our temporary bodyguard. After the death threat, it felt like everything in the house, whether spiritual or physical, decided to let loose. Shortly after, all three of us got sick with a pneumonia that just wouldn't go away. My mom noticed one day that a sunbeam coming through the window was full of sparkling fiberglass particles. It turned out we had been breathing in fiberglass from our air conditioning ducts, which had to be replaced along with the entire air conditioner. The stress and the mounting costs were overwhelming for my mom, and it was pushing her further into debt. To make things worse, Mom had started sleeping on the couch downstairs to keep an eye on both the front and back doors in case her ex-boyfriend tried to break in. One night, she had a terrifying dream where she was in the grip of a demon, being crushed to death. Even after waking up and going back to sleep, the same dream kept returning. The next morning, she was in so much pain, it was as if she'd been in a physical fight. I tried to reassure her that it was just stress, but then I started having strange dreams too. In my dream, I was in the same bed where I was sleeping, so it felt like real life. I could see a blonde man with a goatee coming up the stairs toward me. I felt that he was a construction worker in his 40s, connected to the building of our house, and his intent was to rape someone. He got as far as my doorway before I woke up in a panic. My sister and I had already realized we were both scared to climb the stairs at night, always feeling like something nasty was right behind us. After my nightmare, I associated that feeling with the man I saw in my dream. We later found out from a neighbor that someone had indeed been raped in our house by an intruder at one point in its history. Our pets started acting strangely too. One of our cats, a friendly cream-colored male, seemed to go mad. He would follow invisible movement over your shoulder while being petted, and spent all his time clawing at the front door, desperate to get out. He scratched his paws so badly that they bled, and we eventually had to rehome him. When we visited him at his new home, he seemed normal again. Our two dogs also started peeing in the house. The smaller one developed severe separation anxiety, becoming a nervous wreck every time we left. The larger dog, who was my best friend, developed inoperable cancer. I hoped their issues weren't connected to the house's curse. One day, while I was sitting on the couch talking to my sister, we heard a voice speak a full sentence from underneath the couch. It was the voice box of a broken toy frog that hadn't made a sound in months. Another night, as I was falling asleep with a book, I felt something approach behind me, near my head. I remember thinking, this is what evil feels like. It was disgusting, and it absolutely hated me. I couldn't turn around to face it, but thankfully it left when I prayed for help from God. The house continued to have one expensive issue after another. We found feces under the carpet, so we had to replace the flooring. A bearded old man's face appeared in the paneling on our pantry door. Once, when I was downstairs and my sister was upstairs, we both heard a girl shout, "Mom," from the living room. We each thought the other had called, but neither of us had. Meanwhile, my mom's debt kept piling up, and I lost my job. Eventually, we had to leave the house and move in with my grandfather. My grandfather's house is not haunted or cursed, but my sister did have a strange experience there once, which I might write about later. We had a priest come to enthrone the Sacred Heart and bless our new home, including the pets. Since then, we've had very few problems, and I now have a minor exorcism prayer I can recite when things start to go wrong in an eerie way. I've only used it once, but it worked. I'm a 20-year-old Native American from Arizona, and I want to share my experiences, which have haunted me since childhood. In the late 1800s, boarding schools and missions were built for Native American children as part of an effort to kill the Indian, save the man. These places were traumatic for many, as children were often beaten for speaking their native languages, sexually assaulted, and sometimes even killed. With all the suffering that took place, it's no surprise that they harbor negative energy to this day. When I was 5, I was sent to one of these missions, and it was there that I had my first paranormal experience. On my first night, after being paddled, spanked with a wooden board, I was told to stand in the hallway with my nose in the corner as punishment. As I stood there, I heard humming and children's laughter coming from the restroom. When I told the person in charge, they just told me to pray and sent me to bed. As I spent more time at the mission, I learned that the school was built on top of a Native American cemetery. In the little boys' dormitory, there were reports of ghost children running down the halls and a tall dark figure that roamed the area. In the older boys' dormitory, a ghostly girl would knock things over, and another dark figure often stood near the exit sign. The older girls' dormitory had even more disturbing incidents, like demonic possessions where girls would pull out their hair, jump like frogs, and scream profanities. As a child, hearing these stories was terrifying. Over time, I got used to seeing and hearing things. One night before my 8th grade promotion, a few friends and I stayed up late telling stories. Around midnight, the bathroom door opened on its own. One of my friends went over and came back saying, "It wants to talk to you guys." As soon as he said that, the mop and broom fell over. The dorm parents came out, and we told them what happened. When they checked the bathroom, the mop and broom were lying on the ground. After I finished 8th grade, I moved back home, but the strange occurrences followed me. At night, I would hear knocking on the walls, scratching under my bed, and my bed would shake. I would also see shadowy figures. This continued until I graduated high school and left for college. At my new apartment, things didn't change. Items would move on their own, and my kitten would hiss and act scared, staring at something unseen. Sometimes it would pounce and play with something that wasn't there. One night, my grandparents stayed over. Around 4 a.m., my grandma got up to use the bathroom and saw a black figure standing in the hallway outside my door. She called out to it, but it disappeared. My mom lived nearby, and I sometimes did laundry at her house. One day, while sitting in the living room, the dryer suddenly stopped. When I checked, the door was open, and some clothes were on the floor. After that, my mom had her house blessed. After a year of college, I moved back in with my grandparents, but things got worse. My cousin once saw a black figure crawling out of my room after the door slammed shut. I tried to ignore it, but it became harder after I had a disturbing dream. In my dream, it was the end of the world, and my family and I were walking along a path to heaven. Suddenly, a flood came and washed us away. I managed to swim to the side and found a door, which led to a dark room. The only light was an exit sign, just like the one from the mission. Inside the room, a man told me to hide. Then I saw a hairy, dark figure walking toward me. I couldn't move or speak. That's when I was slapped in the face and woke up, my face stinging. I still don't know what that dream meant or who slapped me. Sometimes I think it was God waking me up before the figure could get me, but other times I wonder if it was the figure itself showing me it could reach me even in my dreams. A few days later, I had a prayer done for me, and since then the experiences have stopped. I still wonder if the spirits at the mission were the children who died there, and if the dark figures were the ones who hurt them. Whatever it was, I believe it latched onto me. My dad was a hard-working man who loved his family deeply. He was simple in many ways, but pure of heart. I know he always did what he believed was right. Tragically, he was diagnosed with small cell lung cancer, and after nearly a year of fighting it, we thought he was finally recovering. We went to his follow-up appointment, hoping for good news, but instead learned that the cancer had come back with a vengeance. It had spread to his brain, adrenals, and other areas. That day remains one of the worst days of my life. The doctors offered brain radiation, but only as a palliative treatment to prevent seizures and ease pain. We were advised to contact hospice and prepare for the end. On April 29, 2012, my father passed away in his bed, surrounded by our family. I won't go into too much detail about his passing, as it's still very hard for me to talk about. However, I will say that he waited for my grandma, my mom's mother, not his, to come say goodbye before he passed on. I'd like to thank the mods for allowing me the space to commemorate him. That same summer, my wife and I went camping in northern Arizona, a place my dad loved. He used to call it going up north, and I wanted to keep that tradition alive with my own family, as the memories I had with him were priceless. We had a peaceful weekend, but on the way back, we got a bit lost on the Forest Service roads. My wife panicked a little, but I reassured her, saying, "Don't worry, Dad is guiding us through here. We'll be fine." She calmed down, and soon after, we came around a corner to a sign that read Willow Springs, one of my dad's favorite spots. It felt like he really was leading us. Not long after his passing, about 3 months later, I had a vivid dream about him. In the dream, he came back to our old house and walked through the front door. I was overjoyed to see him and had so many questions to ask about the afterlife. But when I asked him, his answers were short and half-hearted. I asked what it was like, and he told me that he was lonely except for one friend. He also said it was very scary. The dream ended with him wrapped in a blanket, lying on the floor because he was cold. I hugged him, laid my head against him, and cried. I woke up from the dream in the middle of the night and wrote down everything I could remember. I no longer have that document, so I can't recall all the details, but those moments have stuck with me and shaped the rest of this story. My dad mentioned that he was lonely except for his one friend. That friend passed away shortly after my dad, following a long illness. On his deathbed, the friend told his wife not to worry because my dad had come to collect him and that he was no longer afraid of dying. Moments later, he passed away peacefully. While some details of my dream disturbed me, especially the part about my dad being scared, I started looking into dream interpretations. I learned that seeing a loved one afraid in a dream can signify a warning of something difficult or dangerous ahead. On the other hand, seeing someone wrapped up in a blanket could mean a baby is on the way. Shortly after, we found out that my wife was pregnant. Exactly 1 year and a few days after my dad's passing, our daughter was born. After years of struggling to conceive, it felt like a miracle. I had always been open to adoption since I'm adopted myself, but we were overjoyed to finally have our own baby. Our daughter was born on May 2nd, 2013, almost exactly 1 year after my dad's death. Looking back, I realized that my dream was a signal from my dad about our daughter's arrival. I felt it in my heart. But what about the warning? What was the scary part about? In September of that same year, I was driving home from work when, out of nowhere, I couldn't keep my truck straight. It kept veering to the left. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later that evening, I started feeling weak and clumsy on my left side. I told my wife, and she insisted we go to the hospital. It turns out I had suffered a stroke in the right side of my brain, and I was very lucky it wasn't fatal. I immediately thought back to my dad's warning in the dream. I had been overweight, had high blood pressure, was developing diabetes, and had been a heavy smoker, even though I was only 35 years old. I believe my dad was trying to warn me to change my ways, and when I didn't listen, I suffered the consequences. Since then, I've been recovering, and though some deficits remain, I've gone from relearning how to walk to working full-time again. Most people wouldn't even know I had a stroke just by looking at me. I feel incredibly lucky and can't help but think I might have an angel watching over me. Fast forward to July 4th of this year. My dad loved the 4th of July, lighting off fireworks, grilling burgers, and watching the show with family. We had all gathered at my mom's house, and I had been thinking about my dad a lot. Suddenly, I smelled cigarette smoke very strongly in the room. My dad was a heavy smoker, and I hadn't smoked in nearly a year. No one else in the house smokes. When I mentioned it, my wife said she smelled it too, but only briefly. We believe it was my dad saying hello, reminding us that he's still around, especially for his favorite family celebrations. Later that night, we took a photo of my mom sitting on the floor with my daughter and niece. In the reflection on the television screen, which was turned off, there appeared to be a man standing next to them. My dad would have loved his grandkids, and while the image isn't very clear, several people have commented that it looks like a man standing there. It could be my imagination or just pareidolia, the brain interpreting shapes as human, but I like to think it was my dad stopping by to check on his family. One final thing happened recently. After a long day at work, I was showering, and as I let the water hit me, I started talking to my dad in my head. It felt like I was really having a conversation with him, unlike anything I've ever experienced before. I was recently visiting my grandma with my wife and daughter. We were having a great time chatting and playing with our daughter when I remembered an incident that took place years ago. I think I might have mentioned it in a comment a long time back, but I can't quite recall, and I haven't gone through my comments to check. The reason I'm mentioning this is because recounting an event that happened so long ago, especially one that feels profound, might come across as fabricated. I'm always skeptical when people suddenly remember they had a bunch of old ghost stories to share, and now here I am doing the same thing. But in reality, it's just one story that has stuck with me all these years. So, here goes. Years ago, I used to mow the lawn for my grandma. She has a very large yard, almost an acre, so mowing it was no small task. Grandma would often come outside to sweep the patio or do something small to feel like she was contributing. I'd have to urge her to go inside where it was cooler and make me some iced tea, just so she wasn't working while I was supposed to be helping. I think she just liked being near me. This particular event happened during one of those times when I convinced her to go inside, and I feel like it might not have happened if she had stayed outside. Sorry for the long backstory. I was nearly finished mowing, and I had stopped the mower to grab the iced tea from Grandma. Suddenly, I felt a cool breeze, which was odd for the time of year in Arizona. As I stood there, I found myself thinking of my grandfather, who had passed away in his sleep when I was very young, on my grandma's birthday, of all days. I looked up at the sky, which was fairly clear except for a few scattered clouds. One cloud in particular caught my eye. It was strange. It appeared to be scrolling. I'll try to explain. It was like the cloud was unraveling, like pulling a roll of paper towels, continuously moving with the air. I hope that makes sense. As I watched, letters began to take shape in the clouds. At first, I saw the word hi. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then the word hello scrolled out clearly in front of me. Oh wow, I thought. And then the most profound word yet appeared. Cecil, my grandfather's name. I was amazed, but strangely I wasn't surprised. What struck me the most was how calm I felt, like it was totally normal to see words forming in the clouds, as if this kind of thing happened all the time. Right after it happened, I told my grandma, who had come back outside to sweep again. She had tears in her eyes and kept looking up to see if she could catch something, but there was nothing more to see. I felt a little sad that she didn't get a message from Grandpa, especially since she loved him so much. But I felt like the message had been just for me and Grandpa. During my recent visit with Grandma, I brought up the story again, but she didn't remember it. She's almost 88 now, and her memory is a bit hazy. However, she did tell me that my grandpa always really liked me and that we had a special connection, even when I was young. I remember a lot about him, but I do wish I could have known him better as an adult. He was a good man. So what do you all think? Does it sound crazy or unbelievable? I swear this is 100% genuine. He has struggled with depression for a long time. A few years ago, our family went through a lot of stress. I had some troubling encounters with threatening students, one of whom later committed murder. This led to a lot of tension at home, and it hit E particularly hard. In October 2013, I had the first of 4 mini-strokes. When this happened, things fell apart for E. He had a major depressive episode, and life became very difficult for him. In November, he stayed overnight at a friend's house where they played Cards Against Humanity and laughed all night long. A good way to escape the heaviness of his depression. After everyone had gone to bed, he heard a girl laughing in the living room. He knew no one was up, but the laughter moved into his room. He didn't feel threatened at first and sensed that the girl was about his age and shy. What he didn't realize was how open he was at the time. Perhaps the depressive episode had made him more vulnerable. Still, he felt a connection with her and, without realizing it, invited her to come home with him. But she wasn't the shy little girl he thought. I started getting uneasy feelings that something wasn't right, but for a while, he was so happy to have someone to interact with. It sounds strange, I know, but E's depression worsened. He went through a roller coaster of medications, with doses being adjusted constantly. At one point, he had to be hospitalized for a week. Despite therapy and medication adjustments, he still heard the girl, though not as often. We began to wonder if she was a real ghost and not just a symptom of his condition. In April, E became suicidal again, and the girl supposedly talked him out of stepping in front of a train. It was clear she wanted more of his energy. By June, his depression worsened again, and that's when I knew we had to get rid of her. This wasn't just about his mental health anymore. That's when I turned to Rook's cleansing method. I've been using these tools for years, so I was well prepared. I already had 6 selenite wands in my bedroom to create a protective vortex. When E went to visit his friends again 2 weeks ago, I decided to get to work. I bought salt and made blessed water. While he was away, I blessed the house. I had planned to salt the perimeter of the property early the next morning, but at 1:30 a.m., E called, saying he felt like he was being watched. He asked, "I wonder why she can't see it?" That's when I knew the whole problem was her. I was worried about E's reaction when I told him he needed to let her go. But, thankfully, he had already begun to sense that she wasn't as harmless as she appeared. I quickly salted the perimeter of our property and sprinkled holy water around. Then, at 2 a.m., I drove 35 miles to pick him up. On the way home, as we talked about the need to get rid of her, E heard a nasty voice saying, "So, this is how you repay me." That's when he realized she wasn't a sweet, innocent girl. Our plan was for E to push her away as we backed into our driveway, which was lined with salt. He didn't sleep well that first night, and by Monday, he still felt like something was touching him. We talked about whether this was a psychic experience or something else, but E didn't have any other psychotic symptoms, and he felt better inside the protective selenite. He stayed in my room that night, but I could hear him moaning and making strange animal sounds in his sleep. On Tuesday, I went back to Home Depot and bought a 40-pound bag of salt. This time, we cleansed the house and salted the perimeter together. We also sprinkled blessed water around the house, and E took a long salt bath and cleansed himself with rosemary. I bought 6 more selenite wands for his room. Every day since then, I've had to do healing work on him, helping to relax him and heal the chakras that the entity had been draining. It has been incredibly hard on him. He visited his friends again last night, and we both feel confident that he returned unscathed this time. The room he stays in when he visits his friends has a dark history. 2 previous tenants had emotional breakdowns. One hid in the closet for 3 days before they found him. Clearly, this entity was very nasty. I'm exhausted, and I'm sure I've missed something. Do I need to resalt the property perimeter regularly? E is still battling depression, but I hope that with this entity gone, he'll start to see the light at the end of the tunnel again. It had been draining his life force for far too long. My biggest takeaway from all of this is, be careful what you invite into your life. When I was 16, I signed up for a week-long dig at the Homolovi ruins through Earthwatch. My aunt had sent me the magazine, and since Indiana Jones was my hero, or so I thought, turns out it was just a crush, I was determined to become an archaeologist. Years later, I earned my BA in cultural anthropology, but let me tell you, it was far from the Indiana Jones life. So there I was in Williams, AZ, on the Hopi Reservation. I lived in Flagstaff at the time, so my parents weren't too worried about dropping me off for a week. My dad kept telling me to call if I wanted to come home, but I shrugged it off and said I could handle it. We stayed in dorms in town, and every morning at 7 a.m., We'd ride in vans to the dig site and work until 4 p.m. After that, we had nothing to do until the next day. The anthropologists gave slideshows and talks, but they were dull. Homolovi is where the Kachina cult appeared, and I already knew about the peaks being sacred. Most of my free time was spent helping the cook wash dishes or working on a painfully tedious 2,000-piece puzzle of water. At the site, my job was to walk on top of the ancient houses and brush off dirt with a broom. It was mind-numbingly boring, and I kept staring at the San Francisco peaks, daydreaming that my high school crush would pull up and whisk me away. There were strict rules about the site. No one was allowed to touch anything without the anthropologist's permission, no digging, and no souvenirs. The Hopi tribe wasn't too happy about the dig, so the team was rushing to gather as much information as possible before the tribe called it off. Our dorms were locked and bolted at all times, and no one was allowed inside during the day. The cook was the only one who didn't go to the dig site, but even he didn't have a key. The anthropologist was paranoid about anyone taking anything, and honestly, I think he would have strip-searched us if he could. Near the end of the week, I was the first one back from the dig, rushing to my room to grab my things for a shower. Hot water ran out fast, so I didn't waste time. As I hurried down the hallway, I saw a large black piece of broken pottery lying outside the room next to mine. I was the first one back, and I knew no one was supposed to touch anything from the site. I thought to myself, that's not good, but I stepped over it and grabbed my stuff. On my way back, the pottery was gone. I didn't think much of it and went about my evening. That night, I had the most vivid and terrifying dream. I was back at home and there was a knock at the front door. I went downstairs, looked through the door window and froze. Standing there was a mummified Hopi man, and he was furious. He was trying to shapeshift into my brother, but I refused to open the door. He kept banging on it until, in my dream, my brother came downstairs and opened it. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. My brother stared at his twin, and the Hopi man shattered his disguise and started coming after me. He was screaming, "Where is it? Where is it?" I was terrified, yelling, "I don't have it." I put my arm up to protect myself, and the Hopi man opened his mouth and began to swallow my arm. I could smell him and feel his breath until I suddenly woke up. I was drenched in sweat, back in the dorms, with a sense of something pacing outside my door. I had a strong urge to open it, but remembering the dream, I grabbed the sheets and held onto the bed, fighting the feeling. I lay there, listening to whatever was outside, until the room turned gray with the sunrise. Then it stopped, and I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I told my roommate, a girl from England, about the dream. She asked if I was Native American, and I laughed, saying, "No, I'm Icelandic and Scottish." I told her I must have imagined the black pottery and stressed myself out. At breakfast, I wasn't thinking much of it until the anthropologist banged on the table for everyone's attention. He held up the same piece of black pottery I had seen in the hallway and demanded to know who brought it back. No one said anything, and I certainly didn't. He was furious, but he eventually let us finish eating. I think that was my last day there, and I still don't know what happened to that piece of pottery. My family and I moved into our new home 2 weeks after my youngest was born in March of this year. The very first night, we all camped out in the master bedroom because we hadn't set up any beds yet, and it was the only carpeted room in the house. We were exhausted after the move and settled down for the night. It wasn't long before my 2 boys and baby drifted off to sleep, their gentle breathing filling the room. My husband and I were lying there quietly, trying to relax our minds after the long day, when suddenly, a faint scratching sound broke the calm. It sounded like a chair being pushed across the hardwood floor in the dining room, just behind our closed bedroom door. The sound faded, and I turned to my husband and asked in a whisper if he had heard it. He said he had, but didn't seem as puzzled as I was. What confused me was that all our family members were either sleeping or in the same room, and nearly all our furniture, including dining room chairs, was still piled in the front room on the other side of the house. I strained to hear any more sounds, but eventually fell asleep when nothing else happened. Over the next 6 months, other strange things began happening that made me wonder if we were sharing our space with someone or something. A few weeks after we moved in, I was about to run a quick errand, and my husband stayed home to watch the kids, who were sitting down for dinner. I went to our bedroom to grab my keys, reached into my diaper bag, and took out a black plastic key about 2.5 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. I also grabbed my sunglasses. I was going to slip the key into my jacket pocket, but decided not to because I didn't want to scratch the sunglasses. I walked out of the room to talk to my husband in the dining room, and after chatting for a few minutes, I turned to leave. As I went to grab the key, which I still felt in my hand, I opened my palm, and it was gone. Confused, I told my husband what happened, and we both assumed I must have dropped it somewhere between the bedroom and dining room. We searched for 45 minutes, but found nothing. Our boys were still eating dinner during most of our search and had no idea what we were talking about when we asked if they had seen or touched the key. I was frustrated, but I chalked it up to mommy brain and took my husband's truck instead. Over the following weeks, I searched everywhere for that key. Trash cans, shoes, jacket pockets, heater vents, unpacked boxes, the yard, the driveway, cupboards, toy bins, and even other vehicles. I tore apart my diaper bag multiple times, but the key was never found. We eventually had to pay a hefty price for a new one. About a month after the key went missing, my husband went on a 10-day missionary trip. Whenever he's away, I get a bit uneasy, so I lock up the house extra carefully. One afternoon, before stepping out, I locked the side door and deadbolted the front door. When I returned home a few hours later, I was the first one inside, and as I walked through the room with the side door, I noticed the locks were both unlocked. I thought maybe I hadn't double-checked them, so I brushed it off. But 2 days later, the same thing happened. I made sure the side door was locked and deadbolted before leaving, but when I returned, the locks were undone again. I was puzzled, but blamed it on being overtired. Another strange incident happened while I was in front of the mirror in the master bathroom, putting my hair up. My kids were coming in, and I quickly hid a bag of candy in the cupboard to keep it out of their sight. The next night, I decided I wanted some chocolate, but when I opened the cupboard, the bag was gone. I searched every shelf but found nothing. I later asked my husband if he had taken it, but he hadn't. A few days later, I found the candy bag in the back of a little used blanket drawer in my closet. Then, one night while my husband was away, I locked all the doors and turned off the lights in the pantry and built-in office. As I walked to my room, I remembered I needed something from the kitchen. When I turned around, I was surprised to see the pantry and office lights on again. Startled, I wondered if I had even turned them off in the first place. I shut them off again and went to bed. The most unexplainable event happened 4 weeks ago on a Sunday afternoon. We had just returned home to have lunch with some friends. After cooking and spending the afternoon with our company, we went to visit my in-laws. The next day, while cleaning, I noticed my husband's dress shoes were missing. He had worn them to church the previous Sunday, but neither of us had seen them since. I told him to check under the bed or in the shoe basket by the front door, but the shoes were nowhere to be found. Weeks went by, and the shoes were still missing. I keep a very clean and organized home, and I was baffled as to where they could have gone. Every Sunday, my husband asked about the shoes, and I suggested looking in different places, but they were never there. Then, on September 21st, my husband got up early for work and happily said, "Hey, where did you find my shoes?" I sat up in bed and saw them sitting in their spot on the closet shoe rack. I stared in disbelief because I knew they hadn't been there the morning before, or any of the weeks prior. The shoes are a light cream color, almost white, and size 11.5, so they definitely didn't blend in with anything. I asked my husband if he had put them there as a joke, but he hadn't. We both started putting the pieces together, realizing all the odd occurrences we had experienced. That's everything that has happened so far. But I don't feel like it's anything evil or threatening. In fact, I feel comfortable here and don't plan on moving anytime soon. This is a true story of what I have been through with my nephew. To give a bit of background, my brother left his 2 kids with me and my parents, and since then, I'd been helping take care of them. In 2008, my nephew turned 6. About 15 days after his birthday, it was August 1st. That night, I left my bedroom door open so my niece could come and go, as she often did, choosing to sleep with either me or my mom, Grandma. We always kept the kitchen light on at night. My bedroom door opened into the living room, and to the right was the kitchen. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I suddenly heard little footsteps walking in circles in the living room. I looked at my alarm clock. It was 4:09 a.m. A moment later, I saw a shadow walking across my doorway. Curious, I looked out and saw my nephew walking toward the dining room area. I got up quietly and tiptoed to the doorway, watching as he walked toward the front door. He opened the door but didn't step outside. Instead, he just stood there, staring. I watched him stand there for what felt like an eternity, 38 minutes, before he finally turned his head toward my room. Suddenly, he fell to the floor, crying at the top of his lungs. I rushed to him, picking him up and calming him as he fell back asleep in my arms. My mom and dad came running out of their rooms, concerned. I told them he was sleepwalking, and we all tried to settle down again. The next night, he slept with me. In the middle of the night, I reached out to wrap my arms around him, but realized he wasn't in bed. I went into the living room and saw the front door open. It was 3:38 a.m. As I walked over to close the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see him standing there. Instead of waking him, I gently took his hand and led him back to bed. He got into bed but didn't lie down. He sat up for about an hour, and I stayed awake watching him until he finally laid back down and fell asleep. Over the next few nights, strange things continued to happen. I found him standing outside in the yard a couple of times, and once, I woke to find him standing next to my bed. I checked the time. It was 4:28 a.m. I reached out to pull him into bed with me, but when I touched him, his skin was icy cold. When he turned his head toward me, I saw nothing but black where his eyes should have been. I backed away, terrified, and he looked at me with an evil smile, a grin that sent chills down my spine. As I moved to the other side of the bed, he jumped up, landing on the bed with a disturbing, unnatural grace. He crouched on the bed like a frog, then sat upright like a dog, watching my every move. His smile widened, revealing sharp, fang-like teeth. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what I was seeing. This was my little boy, my son, but he didn't seem like himself. He looked ready to pounce, like a predator preparing to strike. Tears started streaming down my face as I slid to the floor, sobbing, confused and scared. The entity, whatever it was, got down from the bed and crouched in front of me, watching as I cried. It leaned in closer, and I instinctively reached out, pulling my son toward me and kissing him on the cheek. But the entity shoved me back, and I hit the dresser behind me. I sat there, crying, as the entity hissed at me like a cat, then slapped me across the face. It sat on my lap, leaning in again, this time licking my tears away. I was horrified, frozen in place. Suddenly, I heard my nephew's voice. "Mommy, Auntie, why are you crying?" I looked up, and there he was, his normal self, his eyes back to normal, his voice gentle and confused. I hugged him tightly, overwhelmed with relief. "Why are we on the floor?" he asked, and I laughed through my tears, telling him it was time to go back to bed. As we settled back into bed, I almost drifted off to sleep when he whispered, "I love you, Mommy." When my mother passed away at 55 from an unexpected heart attack, my primary feeling was anger. She had been seeing doctors for 6 months before her death because she hadn't been feeling well, undergoing countless tests and procedures that cost her around $6,000 out of pocket since she didn't have insurance. The process was exhausting and tedious for her. Eventually, the doctors implied she was a hypochondriac. Anyone who truly knew my mother would know that was the furthest thing from the truth. The way they dismissed her hurt deeply, making her feel like she no longer mattered because she wasn't working and was getting older. She had retired 4 years earlier from a job she absolutely loved on a doctor's advice due to arm pain and high blood pressure. A few weeks after her funeral, I was looking through my closet for something to wear to dinner when I came across a rather fancy blouse I had never seen before. I was stunned. Where had this blouse come from? It didn't fit the occasion, so I continued searching for something else to wear, but the blouse lingered in my mind. You see, just a few months prior, I had semi-retired and moved to a rural area, getting rid of all my business and fancy clothes. I kept only casual wear: jeans, sweats, ski clothes, and flannel shirts. To my knowledge, I had never purchased this blouse, and I certainly hadn't seen it before. It had been years since I had shopped for clothes, as I wasn't fond of dressing up and already had plenty to wear. And yet, here it was, the only dress blouse in my sparse wardrobe, hanging in a large closet in a strangely obvious spot. After I got dressed, I decided to check the blouse for a price tag and the label. In my family, we had a habit of buying second-hand clothes because we loved nice materials and quality construction that we couldn't afford new. We specifically looked for well-made fabrics and often found designer labels: Chanel, Christian Dior, Armani, Versace. We weren't trying to be snobbish, we just appreciated the quality and cut that came with those labels. So I checked the label on this blouse, fully expecting to see Chanel or something similar. But instead, the label said, "I love you." At that moment, my heart leaped into my throat. I was overwhelmed with shock, fear, and disbelief. The little hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I just knew instinctively that it was a message from my mother. Then I thought to myself, that's ridiculous. You're being irrational. I searched for a price tag and found the handwritten tag of a second-hand store, confirming I had never worn the blouse. Initially, I felt warm and comforted, believing it was my mom's way of sending a final message of love. I loved my mother deeply. But then, a dark thought crept in. What if it wasn't really her? What if it was an evil spirit trying to take advantage of my grief and anger? This fear overtook me, and I immediately shut down the thought that it could be my mother reaching out to comfort me. I rejected the idea that she was trying to tell me she was okay and that I should let go of my anger. It took me over 5 years to finally let go of that anger, and I've always regretted missing that opportunity for comfort, for acknowledging her presence and her good wishes for me. In later years, I came to accept that it was my mother, and I now find peace in that. I believe she understands why I reacted the way I did and forgives me. My mom was born on December 3rd, 1928, and passed away on December 5th, 1983, when I was 27. Not a day goes by that I don't think of her and miss her deeply. Things started happening when I was young, and it's taken me a while to fully grasp what I experienced. To give you a better understanding, let me describe the layout of my old house. It was a 2-story home. When you walked in, the first thing you saw was a den with exercise equipment. If you walked straight ahead, you'd reach the kitchen and dining room on the left, and to the right was the living room. In the far corner of the living room was the staircase that led upstairs. Once you were upstairs, you'd see the master bedroom to the left and the upstairs bathroom straight ahead. To the right, there were 3 rooms. The farthest one belonged to my mother. My parents didn't sleep in the same room. The middle room was mine, and the last room was my brother's. My first strange experience happened when I was around 10 to 12 years old. I remember waking up early for school, lying in bed with my eyes closed. I heard my mom come into my room, sit on the edge of my bed, and gently run her fingers through my hair. Comforted, I fell back asleep. When I woke up, though, I felt uneasy. Something didn't sit right with me. I asked my mom if she had come into my room that morning, but she was confused and said no. I asked everyone else in the house, and they all said the same thing. From that moment on, I began noticing things that I couldn't explain. I tried to brush them off, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Sometimes, when I was home alone, I'd hear what sounded like people yelling and screaming, as if 2 people were in a heated argument, but no one was there. One night, I was sitting at the dining room table, doing my homework. My parents were out, but I was expecting them to return at any moment. Suddenly, I heard the front door open, voices talking, and then the door shut again. The voices stopped. I looked toward the door, confused, but shrugged it off. About 20 to 30 minutes later, still feeling uneasy, my parents came home. Frustrated, I asked them why they had left after coming in earlier, but they had no idea what I was talking about. There was always a heaviness in that house. Friends who stayed over would often say they felt like the place was haunted, and I couldn't help but agree. After we moved to a new house, things were quiet for a while. No strange experiences, no unexplained sounds. But then, when I was in high school, something happened. One day, I was in my room getting changed, and my boyfriend was with me. The door was open, and I heard footsteps coming down the hallway that sounded like my brother. I quickly tried to shut the door since I was half dressed. But as I pushed the door, I felt a strong resistance, like something was pushing against it from the other side. I yelled at my brother, telling him I was changing, but the door wouldn't budge. My boyfriend rushed over to help me push, but no matter what we did, we couldn't get the door to close. All I could see was a dark mass on the other side. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut with such force that we were thrown off balance. Once I was dressed, I called my brother and started yelling at him, demanding to know why he'd been messing with the door. His confused response left me shaken. I'm not even home. No one had been home. That was the worst experience I've had, and I still don't know what to make of it. I haven't experienced anything else since then. Whatever that presence was, it hasn't returned. I'm not sure if it was just a normal spirit or something else entirely. When I was 8 years old, my mom and dad decided to move to a new neighborhood. Growing up in a strict Christian family, I had many restrictions. I wasn't allowed to watch Harry Potter, go trick-or-treating, or listen to certain types of music. After we moved all our things into the new house, my mother called our pastor and his family to come bless the home. At first, everything seemed normal. The paranormal encounters didn't start immediately, but they slowly progressed the longer we stayed there. My first experience happened one night when I went downstairs to get a drink from the refrigerator. I left the lights off to avoid waking my parents. After I got back to my room, I sat on my bed finishing my drink, when suddenly, my bedroom door slammed shut. Startled, I waited to see if the noise had woken my parents, but everything remained quiet. Since nothing else happened, I brushed it off and went to sleep. On school days, my parents were still at work when I got home, so they had given me my own house key. My usual routine was to come in, start on homework, and watch cartoons until they got home. But one afternoon, something unusual happened. As I was beginning my homework, I heard the TV downstairs suddenly blast on at full volume. I jumped up and rushed downstairs, thinking my dad might have come home early, but no one was there. I quickly found the remote sitting on top of the TV and turned it off. Frightened, I told my dad about the incident. Surprisingly, he believed me when I said I thought there was a ghost in the house. He decided to contact the landlord to see if he knew anything about the history of the home. The landlord told my dad that while he didn't believe in physical ghosts, he did think there were spirits in the house. He went on to explain that a couple had lived in the house a few years before. On the outside, they seemed like ordinary people, but according to the landlord, they were not. He claimed they would create potions and concoctions to summon the dead. After learning this, my dad chose not to tell my mom, knowing she would panic. Instead, he reassured me, saying, "God will protect us." For a while, things seemed to calm down. There were occasional odd occurrences, lights flickering on and off, doors slamming, but nothing as unsettling as before. Now that I knew the history of the house, I wasn't as scared. That changed when my mom had her first and last paranormal encounter. One night, we were both lying on her bed watching TV. My mom had fallen asleep beside me, but I was still awake. Just as I was about to drift off, the TV suddenly blasted at full volume, playing music from the music channel. My mom woke up, startled, and yelled at me, thinking I was messing with the remote. We both scrambled to find the remote, but when we finally located it, it was sitting on top of the TV. My mom didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but that night, something happened that neither of us could explain. As we sat there, we both heard a voice echoing throughout the house, calling out the words, "Help me." I grew up in a house with my parents and 6 siblings, a house I believe had more than one ghost. One was a small boy, and we simply referred to him as the boy in the blue and white striped shirt. The other was a tall man, though we never really saw him, but his presence was always felt. One of my earliest memories is sharing a bedroom with my younger sister, where we had bunk beds. We were always scared to look toward the doorway, and especially the closet, which felt like it didn't have an end. Even now, as I type this, those memories send a chill down my spine. The little boy wasn't particularly scary, just a nuisance. He would take things and hide them in strange places, leading to endless arguments among us. We had a large mirror in the foyer, about 6 or 7 feet tall, and we would often catch shadows quickly passing by. Our toilet in the kids' bathroom would flush on its own every night at exactly 10:13 p.m. If we needed to go during the night, we'd always ask someone to come with us. I should also mention that across the street from our house was a 2-acre abandoned farm, with an old farmhouse that had 2 big windows. No matter what time of day or night, there always seemed to be someone standing in one of those windows. Our kitchen faced the front of the farm, with the sink positioned by the window. I was 10 years old when I realized that my brother, who was 9 at the time, was seeing the same things I did. Around that time, my mom decided it was time for us to start washing dishes. On my first night doing them, I looked out the window and saw a car pull up on the gravel curb near the fire hydrant. It was an old, shiny black car, probably from the 1930s. A tall woman with red curly hair, wearing a long hoop dress, would get out of the car. Her hair moved as if there was a fan blowing on her. She'd look up, and just as she took a step toward crossing the street, she'd disappear. The next night, it was my brother's turn to wash dishes. The following day, I asked my mom if she could start cooking dinner earlier so we could eat before it got dark, but she said no because Dad worked late and we always ate together. My brother began crying, begging not to wash dishes anymore. That's when I realized he'd seen the same woman. "You see her too?" I asked. Needless to say, we didn't get out of dish duty. We just stopped looking out the window while doing them. I lived in that house until I got married at 25. The tall man and the little boy continued to scare us throughout the years, leaving us hiding under the covers, and no one ever wanted to be alone in the house. When I was 21, I started dating a guy who came to pick me up one evening. He later told me that when he sat on the sofa, someone grabbed him by the throat and wouldn't let him get up. The next day, he called to tell me that his mother had warned him not to return to the house because, apparently, her sister had been murdered there. She was a beautician and had added a large room to the end of the house, the same room that became my brother's bedroom. It was also the room our dog, Smokey, refused to enter. He would stand at the doorway, barking and growling furiously. By the time I got married, I had a daughter. My husband had to leave for a year-long military assignment, so I decided to stay with my parents during that time. My daughter, who was just learning to talk, kept saying, "What's that?" over and over, which scared all of us. Her first Easter came around, and I bought her a cute pair of little white patent leather shoes the day before. But by Easter morning, the shoes were nowhere to be found. We searched everywhere, closets, drawers, under beds, even in the cabinets, but they were gone. Fast forward 5 months. My husband returned from Alaska and we moved to Alabama. One day, my mother called me and said, "You won't believe what I found in one of my jacket pockets, the baby's Easter shoes." Later on, my younger sister, who had 2 kids of her own, was going through a rough time. My dad decided to give her the house and move elsewhere. Interestingly, she and her kids never had any issues in the house, and everything seemed calm. When my daughter was 7, she spent the summer with my sister in Phoenix. My husband and I made the long trip to pick her up, and when I walked back into my childhood home, I immediately heard a loud, booming voice say, "Welcome home." My sister invited me to sit down, but I felt so uneasy that I just said, "No, let's go outside." I'm new to this site and have never considered myself sensitive or psychic, nor have I had many experiences of a paranormal nature. Still, the subject greatly interests me. While I know some stories are fabricated, I've talked to enough friends and read enough accounts to believe that not all of them can be made up. Plus, I've had one experience in my life that truly frightened the living daylights out of me. I've seen people talk about shadow figures, and what happened to me fits into that category better than anything else. Compared to other stories I've read, this one might not seem that scary, especially for those who deal with ongoing activity. But for me, this one experience was enough to leave me terrified, and I'm grateful it's not something I've had to face repeatedly. This all happened in 1974 when I was 14. My family lived in a typical ranch-style home, common in the Phoenix area in the 60s and 70s. My parents had bought the house new several years earlier. At the time, my dad was in the Air Force and stationed in Thailand, so it was just my mom, my brother, and me. My mom had a habit of leaving the kitchen light on at night. It made her feel more secure, even though we lived in what seemed like a safe neighborhood. I preferred keeping my bedroom door open at night, as closing it made me feel claustrophobic. My room was at the end of the hallway, my brother's room was next to mine, and my parents' room was directly across the hall from my door. On this particular night, I woke up suddenly and glanced at my alarm clock. It read 1:20 a.m. Still half asleep, I looked toward my doorway, which opened into the dimly lit hallway. That's when I saw it. A shadow on the hallway wall in the shape of a human figure. I know I wasn't dreaming. This shadow moved slowly, and I could even hear the soft sound of footsteps on the carpet as it approached my door. I was petrified. I couldn't move, and I was too scared to scream. It was in that moment that I truly understood what people mean when they say their blood runs cold. I was convinced someone had broken into the house, and I had no idea what to do. So I just lay there, frozen in fear, waiting for the shadowy figure to at my door. But nothing happened. I watched as the shadow stopped moving and seemed to blend into the other shadows in the hallway. After what felt like an eternity, about 15 minutes, I finally mustered the courage to jump out of bed and run across the hall to wake up my mom. In her half-asleep state, she brushed it off as a nightmare and let me sleep with her for the rest of the night. Eventually, I fell into an exhausted sleep. The next morning, I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was secure. I didn't talk about the incident much after that, and for a while, I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. But to this day, I remember the details vividly, as though it happened yesterday. That's not the end of the story, though. Several months later, my dad had returned from his overseas trip. He often stayed up late on his days off since he worked swing shifts, and he had a habit of falling asleep on the couch in front of the TV. This was back in the days before cable, so after the station signed off for the night, there would be nothing but static on the screen. One night, maybe a year after my initial experience, I woke up again and heard someone walking around the house. I saw the shadow of a person moving about, but this time I wasn't scared. I figured it was just my dad getting up from the couch to go to bed. But after a few minutes, I realized he hadn't walked past my door to go into the bedroom. Curiosity got the better of me, so I got up to check. There was my dad, snoring away on the couch, the TV still showing its late-night static. He was lying there as if he hadn't moved for hours. That's when it hit me. Whatever I had seen and heard moving around the house, it wasn't my dad. That familiar sense of terror crept back in, but there was nothing I could do except go back to bed and try to convince myself there had to be some logical explanation for what I'd experienced. To this day, I'm not sure if there is a logical explanation. We moved to a new home shortly after, and I haven't had that kind of experience since. I've had a couple of other weird things happen. As a kid, I was often afraid of things that go bump in the night. My parents divorced in 1965 when I was 4 or 5 years old, and my mom raised my younger brother and me on her own. Maybe the divorce left me feeling insecure and frightened, but I was always scared of noises, things I couldn't explain. These weren't necessarily ghostly encounters, but just sounds that terrified me. I'd hear footsteps outside my window, which made sense when we lived in an apartment complex, or imagine someone walking on the carpet in the hallway at night. Something always seemed to scare me. For instance, when I was 5, we temporarily lived with my grandparents after my mom moved us from Texas to Arizona. One morning, I woke up on the floor next to the bed. I wasn't scared, thinking I had just fallen off in my sleep. But another night, I remember waking up in a panic, calling out for my aunt, because I swore something was shaking my bed intermittently. My aunt came in and lay down with me for a few minutes, and the shaking stopped. She explained that it must have been a nightmare, which I accepted at the time. For years, I believed you had to be fully awake to experience a nightmare. But to this day, I know I wasn't dreaming, and I still don't know why the bed was shaking. Since we were in Mesa, AZ, it wasn't likely an earthquake either. Fast forward about 10 years. By then, my mom had remarried a man who legally adopted my brother and me. We lived in a typical ranch-style house in the suburbs of Phoenix. A new tract home built in the 60s, nothing eerie or old about it. It was just one of those homes everyone was moving into during the suburban sprawl. Even as I got older, I remained afraid of certain noises, especially at night. I often thought I heard footsteps on the carpet in the hallway. His death, but I never saw anything. Looking back, I think the central heating and air conditioning system might have been responsible for some of those sounds. But then, in 1974, when my dad was assigned to go overseas, something happened that terrified me beyond anything I'd ever experienced. I was a freshman in high school by then, and though I had mostly gotten over my fear of those nighttime noises, I still appreciated the comfort of leaving my bedroom door open. My mom, out of habit, left the kitchen light on at night. It was a small comfort, a warm glow in the hallway that made us both feel secure. Except for one night. I remember waking up and looking at my little red travel alarm clock. It was exactly 1:20 a.m. For some reason, I glanced toward my bedroom door and saw a distinct shadow of a human figure on the hallway wall. I wasn't dreaming. The figure was moving slowly toward my door, and I could hear footsteps on the carpet. I was paralyzed with fear. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't dealing with a ghost. I thought it was a real intruder who had broken into our home. I was too terrified to scream or move. I just lay there, watching in horror, waiting for the figure to step into my doorway. But then it stopped. The shadow didn't come any closer. Instead, it seemed to fade into the other shadows in the hallway. I sat there, staring at my doorway for what felt like an eternity. When nothing else happened, I finally gathered the courage to jump out of bed, run across the hall, and wake my mom. In her half-asleep state, she brushed it off as my imagination and let me sleep next to her. The next morning, I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked and secure. I didn't dwell on it much after that, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that wasn't the end of it. About a year later, after my dad had returned from his overseas assignment, I woke up again late one night. I heard someone moving around in the hallway and kitchen, and I saw the shadow of a person cast on the hallway wall by the kitchen light. This time, I wasn't scared because I figured it was just my dad getting up from the couch. He often fell asleep in front of the TV long after the stations had signed off for the night, and I assumed he was finally heading to bed. But after a few minutes, when I didn't hear him walk by my door, curiosity got the better of me, so I got up to check. When I walked into the kitchen, no one was there. My dad was still fast asleep on the couch, snoring away, with the TV showing nothing but static. The weird part was that it looked like he hadn't moved for hours. That's when I started to get that same eerie, terrified feeling. What I had seen and heard didn't make sense. There was no logical explanation for it, but all I could do was go back to bed and try not to think about it. I've never seen a shadow figure again, and honestly, I tend to be skeptical about the paranormal. But between what I experienced and the stories I've heard from friends and family, I can't ignore the possibility that something beyond explanation happened to me back then. It might not be the most exciting story compared to others I've read, but at the time, it scared me so badly that I'm just grateful it wasn't something I had to deal with regularly throughout my life. I've only shared this story with a few people because of how strange and unbelievable it might sound. I've always believed in the paranormal, and I've had several experiences, which I've documented here, but this one remains the strangest. I'm a grounded adult, and I try to stay as factual as possible, so I'm sharing this odd experience that still leaves me wondering. In early November 2016, I invited a longtime friend over to catch up. My wife and daughter were out of town for the weekend, and honestly, I was feeling a bit lonely. My friend brought over a 12-pack of beer, and we spent the evening chatting on my back patio. I had about 4 or 5 beers. Not enough to impair my senses, but just enough for a light buzz. I've never hallucinated from drinking, and I was completely aware of my surroundings. It was around 11 p.m., and as our conversations usually do, we eventually started talking about paranormal topics. My friend mentioned that his sister-in-law had recently become a fairyologist. I laughed at first, thinking he was joking, but he showed me a website related to it. He explained that she was involved in the occult and practiced a type of good witchcraft. Apparently his sister-in-law had offered to place an enchantment on him that would give him fairy companions and bring him good luck. He accepted, and the next day she gave him a purple feather, instructing him to carry it if he ever needed luck. She also told him that he might see fairies. As he told me this story, he casually pulled the purple feather out of his pocket and showed it to me. Then, without missing a beat, he said, "There might be a fairy or two that come around tonight." At the time, I just laughed, not thinking much of it. About 20 minutes later, he suddenly pointed above my head and said, "Look, the fairies are here." I looked up and saw two small, insect-like creatures hovering about 3 feet above me. They were softly illuminated by the ambient light from the house and the street lights. I was shocked. They were slowly descending toward me, and I could see them clearly. As they hovered in front of my face, I was both mesmerized and uncomfortable. I shifted in my chair, thinking it had to be some sort of trick. "Okay, if this is a prank, you got me," I told my friend. But he was serious. "This isn't a prank," he replied calmly. "I wouldn't do that to you. I trust you, and I know you're open to these kinds of things." Despite his calm demeanor, I felt uneasy. I told him it was freaking me out, and maybe it was time to call it a night. He apologized, explaining there was nothing to be afraid of. Almost instantly, the creatures shot off into the distance, but lingered for a while before disappearing completely. Even after they were gone, I still felt unsettled. I kept pressing him, sure that it was some kind of joke, but he seemed genuinely offended. He insisted that what I saw was real, telling me that if I couldn't handle it, he must have misjudged me. Eventually, I apologized, realizing that whether it was real or not, he wasn't messing with me. Before wrapping up for the night, he asked if I wanted to see them again. Though I was still skeptical, curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed. I kept a lookout for anything that could be used to trick me, a moth, a bug, anything, but I saw nothing. My friend told me to relax because the fairies wouldn't come if I was tense. I did my best to calm down, though the whole situation felt surreal. After some time passed, my friend suddenly looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" I nodded, unsure of what to expect. He pointed to an empty chair nearby and said, "There's one sitting there." I turned and saw one of the insect-like creatures hovering near the chair. Its wings moved so fast that they were a blur, but it had perfect control over its movements. I watched, completely captivated, as it hovered in the air, moving with a kind of precision that was unlike anything I'd seen before. Since that night, I haven't spoken to my friend much. He's always been someone I trust, and he's never lied to me, but this experience left me confused. Part of me feels foolish for believing it enough to share, but another part can't dismiss what I saw. I understand how strange this sounds, and I know people will probably point out that I had been drinking, but I've tried to recall everything as accurately as possible. To this day, I'm still not sure what to make of it. A few years ago, I was working at a very small hospital located on the Navajo reservation. It was an old, outdated building with only about 15 patient rooms, arranged in an L shape, with the nurses' station positioned at the corner where the two hallways met. At the end of one of the hallways was a pair of double doors leading to a now unused surgical unit, a more recent addition that had since been closed off. At first, I didn't give it much thought. My shifts were busy, and I rarely had time to explore. But after being there for a while, curiosity got the better of me. How many people get the chance to explore an abandoned section of a hospital? Before I continue, let me clarify that I've never considered myself someone who experiences the paranormal. I've stayed in places reputed to be haunted, but have never seen or felt anything strange, at least not in a way that I couldn't explain away. So, even though I was curious about that closed-off part of the hospital, I didn't expect to encounter anything unusual. One day, I decided to check it out. I opened the doors, which led to a small airlock area before opening a second set of doors that led into the surgical unit itself. The area wasn't anything particularly eerie at first glance. The main room was large, with a hallway toward the back that led to several smaller rooms. The space was mostly empty, save for some old medical equipment that had been retired and a few counters and cabinets along the walls. It was just like any other abandoned space, silent and still. But as I wandered toward the back, I began to feel uncomfortable. It wasn't exactly the feeling of being watched, but there was a strange, oppressive atmosphere. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I can't recall ever feeling anything like that before, and it really stood out. Something in that space just didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the sensation was overwhelming. I never made it to the back rooms. The unease grew to the point where I felt an overpowering compulsion to leave. So I did. I was probably in there for only a few minutes, but the experience left a lasting impression on me. I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had come over me in that moment. I didn't understand why I felt that way in what was just an empty space, but it stayed with me. The hospital had a reputation for being creepy, if not outright haunted. Some staff members reported hearing disembodied voices. Patients would often mention seeing people entering and leaving their rooms during the night, even when no one had been there. Some even requested to be moved to shared wards because they were too uncomfortable staying alone in a private room. Others would talk about hearing knocks on their windows, though this was on the ground floor, so it could have been someone outside. The only strange thing I experienced, aside from the surgical wing incident, was when the automatic hand sanitizer went off by itself one time. I assumed it was just a malfunction. Despite working plenty of night shifts, I never felt spooked in the hospital, aside from that one time in the surgical wing. I never went back in there alone again, though. I did accompany another staff member once when she needed something from that area, and she was too scared to go by herself. About 6 months later, I was chatting with a colleague who had been at the hospital for years. She mentioned that the surgical unit had been shut down about 6 years earlier after a tragic incident. A patient undergoing a cesarean section bled to death. The surgeon and the hospital were found at fault. Learning that was unsettling, though I don't know if it had anything to do with the oppressive feeling I had in that wing. Still, it made me wonder if there was more to that space than I realized. It wasn't necessarily a terrifying experience, but it was certainly intriguing and left me with more questions than answers. The first time I visited Canyon de Chelly, I decided to explore a few overlooks along the North Rim. Each time I stepped out of my vehicle, an overwhelming feeling of despair and death washed over me. It was unsettling, and I couldn't explain why I was feeling that way. When I moved to the South Rim, however, the atmosphere changed entirely. I felt a sense of safety and relief at the overlooks there. That night, I set up my tent at the campground with my dog, Pilar. As I sat at the picnic table, writing in my journal by the light of a lantern, Pilar started tugging on her leash, which was wrapped around my wrist, pulling me toward the car. I called her back, calmed her down, and she sat beside me again. But just a few minutes later, she tugged even harder, trying to lead me to the car again. I told her, "I feel the same way. We're sleeping in the car tonight." That strange feeling of unease never left me, and I swore I'd never return to Canyon de Chelly. 4 years later, I was on a birdwatching and camping trip with 2 other women. One of them suggested we visit Canyon de Chelly, and my immediate reaction was a firm no. But after thinking about it, I decided it was time to face my fear. We hired a guide to take us into the canyon, camp there for the night, and then climb out the next day. That evening, as our guide and I sat by the fire in the canyon, I asked him about the history of the area. He explained that the North Rim is called Canyon del Muerto, while the South is Canyon de Chelly. I hadn't realized they were separate canyons. He told me that Kit Carson and his men had massacred the Navajo people living in Canyon del Muerto, and some survivors fled to Canyon de Chelly. I asked about the campground, and he said that Kit Carson's men were buried there. Suddenly, my feelings of dread from my previous visit made sense. After we climbed out of the canyon, we returned to the campground, and once again, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my tent. I slept in the car, just like before. Things got stranger after that, but that's a story for another time. For context, I'm a seasoned solo camper, hiker, and backpacker. If a place doesn't feel right, I trust my instincts and leave, but it's only happened a few times in my life. A year or so later, my boyfriend and I attended a powwow in Oklahoma, where we camped on the reservation. On the second night, while lying in the tent, I had a vivid experience. A native man appeared, holding my right hand and pulling me toward him, telling me to come with him. I resisted, telling him, "I'm here with Rob, and I won't go." But he kept pulling, and I kept saying no. It wasn't until I jerked my arm away and wrapped it around Rob that the man vanished. In the morning, I told Rob what had happened, and to my shock, he said the same thing had happened to him the night before. He had been visited by a native woman who tried to seduce him, but when he looked at her closely, she transformed into a man. He was so disturbed by the experience that he hadn't told me until I shared mine. A year or two later, I traveled solo to Chaco Canyon, then headed to the Navajo Nation Fair in Window Rock. I had planned to camp nearby, but decided I needed to confront my fear of the Canyon de Chelly campground once and for all. I arrived just before dusk and walked around the campground, something I rarely do. I met a woman who was on her first solo camping trip, and I thought, if she can do it, so can I. After dark, I pitched my tent, wrote in my journal, and went to sleep. During the night, I had an experience similar to what Rob and I had in Oklahoma. A native man tried to seduce me, but this time I was prepared. I said aloud, "Oh, come on. I know what happens next. You can't fool me." He disappeared instantly. I went back to sleep, but woke up later, needing to use the restroom, a rare occurrence for me. I grabbed my dim headlamp and walked to the restroom, careful not to wake any nearby campers. As soon as I started to use the restroom, the door swung open and slammed shut, followed by the stalls on either side of me slamming as well. I thought, there's no way someone could move that fast from the door to the stalls without seeing where they were going. Then, an unnatural rush of water gushed into the stalls on either side of me. Nothing like I've ever heard before. It all happened so quickly, and I was still in the middle of using the bathroom. I bent down to look for feet under the stalls, but there was no one there. When I finished, I washed my hands, walked back to my tent, and said, "Well, you got me. That was a good one." No one ever exited the restroom, and the lights never came on. Surprisingly, I slept soundly in my tent after that. Towards the end of 2012, around August or September, my family, at the time, my sister, her 2 children, and my brother-in-law, decided to move to the Phoenix area. We were considering 2 particular neighborhoods, so we took a weekend to explore and decide which suited us better. This meant spending a couple of nights in a hotel. We ended up in a room where my sister's kids shared one bed, her and her husband in another, and I took the fold-out couch in the front room of the hotel suite. I've always disliked sleeping in complete darkness, which the room was, making it even harder to relax. Without a clock in sight, I wasn't sure what time it was, but I went to bed around 11. Somewhere in the night, I woke up to the sound of a low hum. At first, I thought it might be someone vacuuming in a room overhead. Perhaps the hotel cleaning crew doing their job. But as I lay there, I realized the humming sound was getting louder, growing in volume and intensity. It became hard to ignore. Just as the sound was becoming unbearable, I felt the bed shift behind me. At the time, I was lying on my right side, facing away from the door. The sensation was unmistakable. It felt exactly like a cat jumping onto the bed. I've had cats my whole life, and I know the feeling well. For a moment, I thought it was my older cat climbing onto the bed, walking up toward my pillow to settle in like he usually does. But then it hit me. I was in a hotel room. My cats were back home being looked after by a friend. The realization jolted me, and as soon as I tried to roll over, the weight on the bed vanished. But then a burning sensation spread across my back, most intense along the line from one hip to the other. It felt like something had lifted off the bed and jumped away. I couldn't move at all, frozen in place, staring at a spot on the opposite wall. There, on the wall, I saw a tiny light, about the size of a laser dot, perfectly still. The humming sound was still there, now so loud it felt like I was going deaf. I tried to move, but couldn't. I kept my focus on that small light, silently repeating to myself, what my mother had taught me as a child. You are safe. Nothing can harm you. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, though I don't remember how. The next thing I knew, everyone else in the room began waking up around 6 the next morning. I got up too, shaken by what had happened. When I looked at the wall where I had seen that tiny light, there was nothing. No lamps, no TV, no fire alarms, nothing that could have cast a light there. I still don't know what was in that room with me that night. Whatever it was real enough to make me question what I had experienced. I'm going to start by saying that I've always been a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but I try to keep an open mind. What I'm about to share mostly happened to my younger sister and my father, and I'm still unsure what to make of it. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. I live in a small town in southern Arizona, right next to Tombstone. We moved here when I was in middle school, and now I'm a freshman in college, so it's been about 7 years. 6 years ago, my family bought a plot of land, and we had a construction company build our house from scratch. Every detail was handpicked by my mother, and we've been living in the house for about 5 years now. At first, everything was perfect, nothing out of the ordinary. But about a year in, I noticed my father was having sleep-related issues. It seemed minor at first, so I figured it was work stress. But over time, it became more obvious. My dad began staying up late, almost as if he was avoiding sleep. He started asking me to close the bathroom and closet doors whenever I was in his room, which was odd. This behavior went on for a couple of months until one day, when he picked me up from school, I finally asked him why he was acting so strangely. What he told me scarred my 13-year-old mind. He explained that he'd been having experiences where he'd wake up in the middle of the night to see 3 figures standing at different corners of the room. I thought it might be sleep paralysis, until he described the figures in chilling detail. The first figure was a tall man dressed in 19th century clothing, a pale man with dark hair and a beard, wearing a suit and hat. The second figure was a Native American woman, older with long dark braids and an expression of deep sadness. Finally, there was a little boy with blonde hair, dressed in 19th century children's clothes. My father said the boy was the most active of the 3, and all 3 had dark, hollow eyes. My father was dead serious, and I knew this wasn't a joke. He explained that the tall man and the native woman mostly just watched him, but the boy seemed drawn to the bathroom. Whenever the bathroom door was left open, the boy would appear right next to my father when he woke up in the night. It terrified him, so he made sure the door was always closed. The entities didn't do much beyond watching or occasionally moving closer, but one incident involving the boy truly shook my father. One night, he awoke to the sound of loud banging coming from the bathroom door. He described hearing a child grunting as though something or someone was trying to escape. The next day, we burned sage and incense around the house. After that, the entities seemed to disappear, and my father was finally able to get some sleep. Neither my mother nor I experienced anything unusual, but my younger sister, whom I'll call Zelda, did. She had just gotten her own room, and after a few nights, she came to me asking if she could sleep in my room. She was still pretty young, around 10, so I wasn't surprised. Our rooms are next to each other, separated by a single wall, which just happens to have my bed up against it. Now, this is where I keep an open mind. I believe there's something in her room, something unrelated to the 3 figures my father saw. Whatever it is, it's active, and I'm not sure if it's good. At night, we can hear knocking or tapping on the wall, even when no one is in her room. Her room is the coldest and darkest in the house, and I've never felt comfortable staying in there for more than a couple of hours. Lamps turn off by themselves, her TV flickers off randomly, and her door locks unexpectedly. Her closet door also opens on its own, even when I'm sure I've closed it. One night I was woken by the sound of Zelda screaming. My mom rushed in to find her hiding under the covers with one ear bleeding. It was the most terrified I've ever seen her. She refused to tell me what happened at first, but after I pushed her, she finally opened up. She said she had woken up around 3 a.m. to see a tall, inhuman figure standing by her closet. It had long, unnatural arms and no eyes. She froze, and with every blink, it got closer, like something out of a horror movie. It came right up to her face, and she felt like she couldn't breathe, like something was holding her down. But that wasn't the worst part. The creature unhinged its jaw and stretched it wide, then screamed so loud that it hurt her ears. That's when she started screaming, and we ran in. By the time we got there, the figure was gone. That was about a year ago, and since then, Zelda has been sleeping in my room. We're renovating her room now, and she'll have to move back soon. She's anxious about it, but we've taken measures to make her feel more comfortable. She's allowed to burn incense and has set up a small Buddha shrine in her room. Nothing like that has happened since, but I still get creeped out when I'm in her room at night. I'm not sure what's going on, and I would really appreciate help from anyone who's experienced something similar. I just want some closure on this. My story centers around an old copper mining town in Arizona called Bisbee. It's only 8 miles north of the Mexican border, a little slice of the 1880s, and home to the grand dame of the town, the Copper Queen Hotel. I grew up in California but moved to Texas in my 30s, where I eventually got engaged to the love of my life. Unfortunately, the timing was off. He had recently lost his wife, and I was dealing with a young son, a difficult ex-husband, and an elderly mother. Regretfully, we called off the wedding, and I moved back to California. Fast forward 7 years, I moved back to Texas and, through a strange set of circumstances, ran into him again. We quickly realized that maybe someone, his late wife, or perhaps my late mother or father, wanted us to finally get together. This is where the Copper Queen comes in. We were getting married, and we wanted it to be an adventure. He wanted a wedding in Tombstone, Arizona, but I'd long dreamed of visiting Bisbee. Since they're only 30 miles apart, we found a way to do both. We discovered that you could get married in the upper sitting room of the Copper Queen Hotel. It was perfect. We could spend a couple of days exploring Bisbee and then visit Tombstone to see the gunfight at the OK Corral. The Copper Queen itself is a grand 4-story mansion with stucco walls and terraced steps leading up to it. It overlooks the entire town and is rumored to be haunted, even offering ghost tours twice a week. Not far from the hotel are the copper mines, which also have a reputation for spiritual sightings. We checked in and were offered 2 rooms, the Julia Lowell room, allegedly haunted by a prostitute who killed herself, and the John Wayne room, where the actor stayed during his film shoots, conveniently close to the bar. They took us to see the Julia Lowell room first, but the moment I stepped in, I felt a strong presence, like something saying, "I see you." That was not the vibe I wanted on my wedding night, so I noped out of there as fast as possible. My fiancé, oblivious to the eerie feeling, didn't understand why I was so adamant. We ended up in the John Wayne room, which was decked out with memorabilia from his movies. My fiancé, once a cowboy in Kansas, felt right at home. We got married in the 3rd-floor sitting room in front of a beautiful fireplace as the sun set, both of us in Levi's. Guests wandered by, accidentally stumbling into our wedding and then backing out with an awkward, "Oops." It was funny, sweet, and perfectly us. After the ceremony, we had dinner in the hotel restaurant and ended the night with a few drinks in the hotel's saloon. Later, when we returned to our room, things took a strange turn. I flipped on the light switch, but it immediately flipped back off. I tried again, and the lights turned off once more. Okay. Strange. Then we turned on the TV and it died. We had to call the front desk and they brought up a new one. I could feel energy all around the hotel, but it didn't feel threatening, just curious. I shrugged it off as we finally got the lights working. We went to bed around 1 a.m., but at some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of arguing in the sitting room on our floor. I couldn't make out the words, but it was a man and a woman hissing insults at each other. I could hear music too, like something from an old-fashioned radio, maybe a song similar to the Tennessee Waltz. I looked out through the peephole, but the sitting room was just out of sight. All I could see was the stairwell leading to the lobby. I wasn't about to open the door. My husband told me to ignore it, thinking they'd eventually quiet down. But they didn't. The argument grew louder. Glasses sounded like they were breaking. Was she throwing things at him? After 20 minutes of this, I got fed up and headed for the door. Just as I did, the argument seemed to shift a couple of doors down. I heard their door open and slam shut twice. The voices were still there, just quieter now, behind closed doors. That's when I called the manager on duty. After listening to my complaints, he asked me to come down to the lobby. We went downstairs, and I explained the situation, pointing to the room where the noise was coming from. The manager, looking confused, turned the room register around for us to see. The room 2 doors down? Empty. The room next to us? Empty. 2 more rooms nearby? Also empty. He had a blank expression on his face, as if we'd lost our minds. My husband backed me up, recounting the entire argument and the noise, but the manager pointed out that no one had checked in, and the bar had been closed for hours. He even mentioned that there were cameras in the lobby, and no one had passed through. I had tried to avoid a haunted wedding, but the Copper Queen had the last word. We're heading back there in January for our anniversary. We haven't yet tried the mind tours. That might be even more interesting. Red eyes. When I was about 5 years old, I had a nightmare. It was the only one I've ever had. I knew I was awake because I had fallen out of bed, and like any kid, I immediately headed for my parents' room. But as I turned toward the door, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. Above the doorway, staring down at me, were giant, glowing red eyes, just watching me. Terrified, I ran to my parents' room. Looking back now, I know it was something supernatural, but at the time, I told my mom it was just my brother spying on me. I haven't seen those eyes since, but the memory has stayed with me. My brother was possessed. This experience is from my parents. When I was young, my brother had a bad attitude and would often disrespect us, especially the girls. My mom, trying to get him to respect us more, painted Bible verses on his bedroom wall. I'm not sure why she thought it would work, but the moment my brother walked into the room, he started screaming that it hurt him and begged her to take the verses down. According to my mom, he seemed to be in actual pain. This wasn't an act. He eventually stopped resisting and just lay there. I don't remember much else because I was too young and my parents never really talked about it again. The caretaker, I've always felt a presence in the house, but from this particular spirit, I get more of a protective vibe than anything malicious. It first appeared after one of my parents' frequent arguments. I was lying in bed, feeling the tension in the house, when I suddenly felt a hand gently petting my hair. I assumed it was my mom, but when I rolled over, no one was there. This has happened multiple times over the years, even when there hasn't been an argument. I'm not afraid of it, but I only plan to update if anything changes with this presence. The face. This happened to my sister. She came to me right after it happened, visibly shaken. She had been taking a selfie in my parents' bathroom. She insists the lighting is better there, and when she looked at the photo, she saw a face above her right shoulder. It was a man's face, twisted in agony. When she showed me, I got a strong sense of malice just from looking at it. She denied it was a ghost, saying it must have been a reflection. But I'm sure she wasn't seeing herself. I'll try to get her to send me the picture if she still has it. The dancing man. A few months ago, I was lying in bed with my cat when I noticed her staring intently toward my parents' room. Following her gaze, I saw someone peeking around the doorway. The figure was tall, completely covered in shadows, and moved in an eerie, fluid motion, crouching, peering around the doorframe, then disappearing out of sight. It wasn't anyone from my family. My brother was in the bathroom, my older sister was at work, my younger sister was in her room, and my mom was asleep. I thought it might have been my dad, but then I saw him walk past the shadow without noticing it. I haven't seen the shadow figure since, but I wonder if it's the same entity my sister saw in her selfie. The passing shadow. One day, I was in my room with the door slightly ajar, enough to see into the hallway. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow pass by, then come back the way it came. I assumed it was my younger sister going to the bathroom. The shadow was child-sized, so it couldn't have been my brother who's over 6 feet tall. But then it happened again. The shadow passed by, then returned, repeating the pattern several times. I was starting to get annoyed. When my sister came to get me for dinner, I told her to stop walking in front of my door. She looked confused and said she had been downstairs the entire time. Since then, I either keep my door fully open or fully shut. December 16, 2017. The voices. Even though strange things have happened to me, Ghosts, demons, and maybe even possession. I had never had anything directly talk to me. I tried using a voice recording app that supposedly let ghosts communicate, but I didn't take it seriously. Lately, things have gotten worse. I'll hear the TV on downstairs, but when I go to check, it's off and no one's around. I've been seeing strange lights. Once, a human-shaped light was standing in my mirror. I keep seeing shadows everywhere, and now I'm really scared. The other night, I went for a walk around 6 p.m. It was dark, and I was alone, listening to music. Suddenly, I thought I heard someone breathing behind me. I brushed it off, assuming it was just the wind. Then, while listening to Adele's song Hello, just before the lyrics started, I heard a deep, robotic voice say, "Go die." I was so startled that I rewound the song to see if the voice was part of the audio. It wasn't. I have no idea what's happening, but if the spirits around me are becoming violent, I need help. My family doesn't believe me, so I'm reaching out. I was 8 or 9 years old when my father, brother, and I visited the Grand Canyon. We stayed in an old 3-story walk-up motel, the kind where each room is only 1 deep, and the open gallery runs along the front of each level. It wasn't exactly modern, no air conditioning, which meant every night we slept with the big sliding window wide open. My cot was right up against it, and to say I wasn't thrilled would be an understatement. The first 2 nights, I couldn't sleep at all. The howling of the coyotes was unlike anything I had ever heard before, dreadfully eerie and menacing to my young ears. I was convinced that at any moment, a wild, snarling coyote would come crashing through the tattered screen and devour me whole. On the last night, as bedtime approached, I hoped exhaustion would finally win, and I could sleep through the wretched serenade. As soon as the lights went out, my father and brother fell into their light snores, but I lay wide awake, terrified, waiting for the howling to begin. But something strange happened. Instead of fear, I felt a calm wash over me, like a cool breeze. Then I heard distant voices. Even though I had never wandered off alone before, something compelled me to get up from bed. I unlocked the door and stepped out onto the gallery. Our room was on the 3rd floor, and I could hear the voices more clearly now. A group of people singing. The strangest part? I recognized the song. It was Colonel Bogey's March, though I knew it from the movie The Parent Trap, where the campers whistled the tune. But this time, the song had lyrics. At the time, I could only catch bits and pieces of the words, but I recently looked them up and realized this was what they had been singing. Colonel Bogey's March. Comet will make your teeth turn green. Comet, it tastes like gasoline. Comet will make you vomit, so get some Comet and vomit today. The voices had a distinct Irish brogue, and as I listened, I saw them, dozens of people, materializing on the dark gravel road below. They marched along in a loose formation, singing joyfully at the top of their lungs. The scene was surreal, but rather than frightening, it was cheerful, merry even. They passed by the motel, and as they did, they faded into the night. The singing continued for a few moments, even after they were gone. I went back inside, crawled into bed, and for the first time that trip, fell right to sleep. The coyotes didn't howl that night. For years, I assumed the band had been as real as you or me. But as I grew older, I started thinking more about it, and things didn't quite add up. First of all, where could they have come from? The motel was in such a remote area. I distinctly remember thinking my father had gotten us hopelessly lost on the drive there. We had gone at least 20 minutes without seeing another sign of civilization. Second, why was I the only one on the gallery? Neither my father nor brother woke up, and none of the other guests seemed to hear anything. There were other open windows and a few cars in the lot, but certainly not enough people to account for the group I saw. Third, I could hear their voices clearly, but not the sound of dozens of feet crunching on the dry gravel road. And lastly, the song they were singing hadn't been popular for decades. The tune occasionally pops up, but I've never heard anyone sing those lyrics. And they didn't just fade into the dark like regular people would. They vanished. What were they? Flesh or phantom? I truly don't know. But whatever they were good and merry souls who brought me comfort that night when I needed it most. I spent most of my life in Georgia, but from 1993 to 1996, I lived with my father and stepmother in Litchfield Park, Arizona. The reason for the sudden move was a domestic abuse situation at my mother's home in Georgia. The powers that be intervened, and before I knew it, my sister and I were hastily placed on a flight to Arizona with very few belongings. Before the move, my grades had always been excellent. Studying was my escape, a way to block out the chaos around me. But after starting high school in Arizona, things changed. My math grades began to slip, and I had a lot on my mind. Unanswered questions about the life I'd left behind in Georgia. I quickly formed an impression of my father. He seemed highly intelligent and creative, both in an artistic sense and in abstract thought. At the time, he worked as an instructor at the Palo Verde Generating Station, a nuclear power plant. But I also found him to be very emotional and prone to snap decisions, often saying things he would later regret. Even now, our relationship is strained by misunderstandings and unspoken frustrations. One of the things he said to me, which he later regretted, was, "If you get another bad grade in math, you'll be sorry." Coming from the hellish environment in Georgia, sorry could have meant any number of terrifying things. His words only made my concentration worse, and my report card reflected that. I was terrified to go home and face him. At the time, I attended Agua Fria Union High School in Avondale, about 6 miles from our home. I couldn't bear the thought of handing him my report card, so I decided to avoid the confrontation altogether. My plan was to linger around the school until after dark and then head home, reasoning that by then, his worry would outweigh his anger. In hindsight, it was a terrible idea, selfish and thoughtless, but it's what I chose. As I wandered around the area well before sunset, I found myself in a desolate, isolated spot far from the road and behind a few buildings. It wasn't familiar territory, but I kept moving in what I thought was the direction of home. That's when I saw it, a mountain of shoes. There were hundreds of them, scattered in a heap about 50 feet away from the nearest structure. The sight was strange, surreal. I approached it cautiously, intending to circle around the pile to get a better look. As I drew closer, I could see that some of the shoes had matching pairs among them. Just as I was about to walk the perimeter, a loud, authoritative male voice shouted, "Stop!" I froze in my tracks, heart racing. There was no one around. The sun was still high enough in the sky for me to see that I was completely alone. Yet I had felt the sound waves of the word, as if the voice had come from right next to me, or even from the mountain of shoes itself. The moment I jumped back, the top of the pile tumbled slightly, though I hadn't touched it. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, weaving between 2 buildings in my panic. In my haste, I barreled straight through an old, dried-up wooden fence and fell onto the street behind it. Dazed and out of breath, I was spotted by a police patrol car. They brought me home, and I explained that I had missed the bus. It was a plausible story in those pre-cell phone days, and I told them no one had answered when I called. When I finally got home, I nervously told my father about my fear of showing him my report card. I also recounted the strange incident with the shoes. He brushed it off, saying, "It was your subconscious. You should know your old dad only wants the best for you." But how was I supposed to know I wouldn't face the same kind of abuse in Arizona that I had in Georgia? By then, my faith in adults was abysmal at best. In the end, I was still punished for the grade. My father made me pick up what felt like 100 rotten lemons from under his lemon trees swarming with fruit flies. He didn't punish me for my lack of trust in him, though. My math grades improved after I was finally able to talk to my mom again. I've always been a voracious reader, and books have been my constant refuge. Right now, I'm reading Titus Alone by Mervyn Peake. This story begins the week I moved into my new place in Phoenix, where odd little sounds and experiences set the stage for something much stranger. If you're bored with stories about creaky noises and disembodied voices, feel free to skip to the last paragraph for my favorite part, the tale of the orb. On the first or second night after moving in with my partner, I fell asleep on the couch in the living room while watching a movie. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of a flickering fan going berserk in the dining area. Ticka 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 ticka, it went, the blades casting strange shadows across the room in the dim light. It startled me at first, but I chalked it up to faulty wiring. Still, I hurried off down the dark hallway to the bedroom, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. The next day, I told my partner about the fan incident. As I was describing the scene, I looked over to the dining room and realized something odd. There was no fan in the dining room. My partner, amused, confirmed, "We don't have a dining room fan." He was right. The only thing there was a dim light above the table, flickering every now and then until we replaced the bulb. No ghosts there. Just a quirky light. Throughout the 2 years we've lived here, there have been other strange little occurrences. Often I hear noises in the kitchen, plastic moving, rustling sounds. But when I check, there's no plastic anywhere, no obvious source for the noise. The cabinets are all new, with no signs of pests. I've tried rattling things, making noise to scare off anything that might be hiding, but there's never anything to chase off. It's unsettling but not too weird. Another time, I was sitting in the living room when I heard my partner at the end of the hallway saying in a very sleepy voice, "So tired." It wasn't unusual for either of us to say something like that, especially at the end of a long day. But this time, I knew for a fact that he was in the bedroom with the door closed. And the door is so creaky, I definitely would have heard it open. Sure enough, when I went to check later, the door was still closed. I chalked it up to an auditory hallucination, which can happen sometimes, but it still felt a little eerie. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe a ghost was sharing its tiredness with me, or mocking me in my own fatigue. Sometimes, I also hear what sounds like footsteps on the bamboo rug in the hallway when no one else is home. These little things happen often enough that I've grown used to them, but they still make me pause. But now, the orb. About a week into living in the new place, I had my second round of night frights. I was fast asleep when I had an incredibly vivid dream, so vivid it felt real. In the dream, I was exactly where I was, lying in bed, unable to move. A glowing white orb, slightly smaller than a bowling ball, was hovering near my chest, trying to push its way inside me. I could feel the force of it, pressing against my chest, and I was fighting to keep it out. The real terror came from the thought that if the orb got inside me, I wouldn't know if I was still myself or if I had become the orb, functioning as myself. I struggled to resist, but the orb kept pushing, and I was growing too tired to fight it off. Eventually, I lost. The orb won, and I absorbed it into my chest. In an instant, the horror shifted from, "What if I'm the orb?" to a strange sense of calm. Well, I don't feel any different, so I guess it's okay, I thought. The orb had somehow made sure I, the vessel, wouldn't be horrified by the change. It was an oddly pleasant effect. Since then, my life hasn't drastically changed for better or worse, and I still foolishly experience myself as my true self, blissfully oblivious to the fact that I might just be the orb. The Hotel San Carlos, one of the first hotels built in downtown Phoenix, opened its doors in 1928. It's a landmark in the city, and even today, it still operates as a hotel. The famous movie Psycho filmed some of its opening scenes there. A few years ago, I was invited to my niece's art show, which was being held in what was then called the Ghost Lounge, a bar on the hotel's ground floor. Unfortunately, the lounge has since been closed to the public. The San Carlos was once a popular hotspot for Hollywood icons, including Marilyn Monroe, who always requested a room by the pool to avoid the paparazzi. I'd heard rumors that the hotel was home to multiple ghosts, and it has long been a favorite location for ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. Although it's an operating hotel, there have been reports of paranormal activity, with some claiming the spirits of past guests still linger. I arrived at the hotel in the early evening and spent some time admiring the art displays of young, talented artists. There was also a fashion show that showcased some incredible designs. After the event, curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to explore the hotel a bit. I took the old-fashioned elevator to the upper floors, intrigued by the plaques on some of the hotel room doors that displayed the names of famous guests who had stayed there. The hallways were lined with sepia-toned photographs from Phoenix's past, showing scenes from a century ago when the streets were still unpaved and horses pulled trolleys through the dusty roads. It was like stepping back in time. After exploring several floors, I made my way down to the third floor. As I wandered the halls, I started hearing faint big band music. It was static and distant, cutting in and out like an old radio station, accompanied by crackling sounds. I assumed the hotel had an old sound system that piped in music for ambiance, which seemed like a charming touch for a place steeped in history. The music would fade in and out as I continued down the hallway, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere above me, but I couldn't spot any speakers or sound equipment. I didn't think much of it at the time, though I found it fitting for the hotel's vintage atmosphere. After a little more exploring, I decided it was time to head home. I'd parked my car with the hotel's valet service, so I went to the front desk to retrieve it. Casually, I mentioned to the woman at the desk how nice I thought it was that they had big band music playing on the third floor. She gave me an odd look and shook her head slowly before responding. "We don't have any music piped into the hallways," she said. "It sounds like you had an experience." Her confession took me by surprise. She told me that the third floor was known to be the most haunted in the hotel, and she herself refused to go up there because of it. I left the hotel feeling perplexed. Had I really heard something ghostly? This was an operating hotel, after all. Maybe the music had come from one of the TVs in a guest room. But what were the chances that several guests were all playing the same old big band music at the same time? It didn't seem likely. Curious about my experience, I did some research afterward. I discovered that many years ago, a big band director used to stay at the Hotel San Carlos when he performed at the nearby Orpheum Theater. Whether the music I heard was a ghostly echo of the past or something more mundane, I'm not sure. But it's interesting that the music only played on the third floor, the most haunted floor of the hotel. In early 2015, I was working the night shift at a small rural hospital. The hospital had two wings, one for regular patients and one for prisoners who were brought in from the local prison. The prison wing would only be used if there were 5 or more prisoners admitted to keep them separated from the general patient population, avoiding any discomfort for families visiting loved ones. Because of the hospital's small size and rural location, there weren't many people wandering around at night, unlike in larger hospitals. The silence could be eerie. During my shifts, if I had downtime, I would run blood samples and other items to the lab, helping out our CNAs when I could. On occasion, I'd have to go into the prison wing to grab supplies or medications, often alone. The first few times I went in there, the place creeped me out. The air felt heavy, like I was being watched. I'd rush through my tasks and get out as quickly as possible. After those initial visits, I made sure to bring someone with me whenever I needed to go in there. One night, while walking alone to the lab, I passed by the dark and empty entrance to the prisoner wing. That same unsettling feeling washed over me, but I brushed it off and quickened my pace. On my way back from the lab, as I passed the prisoner wing again, I heard someone whistling a tune from inside. I froze for a second, then cautiously peeked in. The room was pitch dark and completely empty. No staff, no prisoners. Who would be in there, whistling in the dark? The answer, I knew, was no one. I ran back to my unit and told a couple of my coworkers. They believed me, but none of them had experienced anything similar. A few months later, during a quiet summer night when we had only a handful of patients, something even stranger happened. Our unit, with its 20 beds, was mostly empty. The patients were all housed near the entrance, leaving the back section vacant. The unit was shaped like an oval, with a nurse's station in the front and another in the back, and every patient room had a glass front, like an ICU room. The empty rooms had their curtains open, while occupied rooms had them closed for privacy. One of my CNAs was sitting at the back nurse's station, charting on a computer, and I went back there to chat with her. As I stood talking to her, my eyes drifted over her head to the empty patient rooms behind her. Mid-sentence, I froze. My mouth hung open as I watched a man in a hospital gown walk from one side of an empty room to the other. Room 113. I saw him clearly, a full apparition, walking across a room I knew was empty. The CNA noticed my expression and started shouting, What's going on?" She jumped up, thinking someone was behind her. I told her, not so calmly, that I had just seen a man in room 113. We immediately went to check with the other nurses, but no patient had died in that room recently. We speculated that maybe it had been the bed, that perhaps someone had died on it before. Unfortunately, there was no way to check. For the rest of the night, that was all we could talk about. It had everyone on edge. A few hours later, the little old house cleaning lady came in to clean, overhearing us discussing the apparition I had seen. She shared her own story, telling us that whenever she cleaned the prison wing alone, she would hear someone whistling in there. I was floored. Months earlier, I had heard whistling coming from the exact same place. Her story completely validated my experience. When I first started working at the hospital, there was one particular room near the front nurse's station that always caught my eye. Sometimes, while charting or walking by, I would catch a glimpse of what looked like a man standing in the doorway out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. I told one of the other nurses about it, and she told me that a male patient had recently passed away in that room. In May of this year, I lost my partner in a horrible accident while we were camping. His gun went off accidentally while we were asleep, and it was the worst day of my life. Friends have often asked how I could bear to stay in the camper after what happened. My answer is simple. The camper was always meant to be a place of rest and relaxation. I refuse to let tragedy take that away from me. Though I deeply mourn the loss of such an incredible man, being in the place where he took his last breath brings me a sense of peace. I know he would want me to find solace there. As part of my healing process, I decided to take the camper on a quiet getaway to an area about 90 minutes north of Phoenix. I found a beautiful, serene spot with stunning views of Sedona and Flagstaff. It's the kind of place where many live a nomadic, vagabond lifestyle or spend their retirement, tempting enough to consider doing full-time. I quickly met a woman around my age who was camped next to me. She mentioned that the two women living in the campsite behind me were visiting relatives in California, but would return that Saturday evening. When the evening came, I settled into bed for the first time since my partner's passing. My bedroom is at the rear of the camper with a large window over the bed. My dog lay next to me, fast asleep. Sometime during the night, I was awoken by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. The two women behind me had returned, and my dog sat up, watching out the window. I could hear the soft murmurs of the women as they brought things inside their camper. Eventually, their door closed, and all was quiet again. My dog settled back down, and soon I drifted off to sleep. A little while later, I was awoken again by my dog sitting up and whining. He stared out the window, and I instinctively sat up to see what had caught his attention. That's when I saw a man standing just a few feet from my camper, right on the edge of my campsite. He didn't seem to notice me, and from what I could tell, he was staring off into the distance. He had curly blonde hair and was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I ducked down quickly, not wanting him to catch me spying, thinking he might be a visitor or family member of the women behind me, maybe out admiring the stars. The campground enforces a strict light ordinance, making the night sky especially breathtaking. Curiosity got the best of me, and after a few minutes, I peeked out again. The man was still standing in the same spot, completely still, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the campsite. My dog was also still watching him, but this time he wasn't whining or growling, just quietly observing. In the days that followed, I finally met the two women who lived behind me. I casually asked if they had a visitor the night they arrived from California. They both looked puzzled and assured me they hadn't had anyone over. When I told them about the man I had seen, they seemed surprised. Unbeknownst to me, they had a Ring camera set up on their camper since it was their full-time residence. They reviewed the footage from that night, and while the camera picked up motion and recorded for 15 minutes, there was no sign of anyone. The camera clearly showed the back of my camper, but no man, no figure, nothing moving at all. I don't know what I saw that night. It wasn't my partner, and I wasn't frightened because I genuinely thought it was a real person. But the fact that nothing showed up on the footage left me deeply unsettled. The woods directly behind our campsites had a reputation for strange occurrences. We'd seen strange orbs of light floating in the dark, coming and going. The two women mentioned hearing crying sounds coming from the woods. There could be logical explanations for these things, but there's no denying how creepy the area can feel in the pitch dark. After I told them about the man, One of the women quietly let me know that she had taken care of it and that he wouldn't be back. She didn't elaborate, but I had the feeling she had performed some sort of ritual. She was from the Osage Nation, and while I didn't ask for details, I trusted her words. This happened back in September, and since then, I haven't seen the strange man again. This happened around 40 years ago. I'm 43 now, and since I was so young at the time, I don't remember every detail. The first part of the story is what I can recall, and the rest is what my parents told me later. My dad had just been stationed at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. While we waited for military housing, we stayed at a motel nearby. Unfortunately, I don't remember exactly where the motel was, but it must have been close to the base, since that's where my dad worked. It all started one day when my mom and I were getting ready to head to the motel's swimming pool. I was in her bedroom, staring into the open closet, and I said in a loud voice, "Stop smiling at me." I remember seeing a black man's face on the shelf inside the closet. He was smiling at me with a sinister grin, his eyes and teeth stark white against his dark skin. I didn't like the way he was smiling at me, but at that age, only around 2 years old, I didn't yet understand fear in the way older children or adults do. I wasn't scared, just uneasy. My mom, hearing me, thought someone was in the room. She called me to leave with her, so I obediently followed. After that, she asked the motel manager to check the room, but of course, no one was there. We spent the rest of the day at the pool, and when we returned, I went back into her room. Once again, I demanded, "Stop smiling at me." My mom, knowing the room had been checked, came in to see what I was pointing at. I showed her the man in the closet, but she didn't see anything. When my dad returned home, he looked as well, but neither he nor my mom could see what I saw, just the sinister smile of the man in the closet, clear as day. They thought I was maybe seeing reflections from something in the closet, so they moved things around. But no matter what they did, I still saw him. Even my grandparents, who came to visit, couldn't see anything, though I continued to insist the man was there. Every time I went into that room, I could see him. Thankfully, when we moved into our new house on base, I never saw the man again. But the story doesn't end there. The following events are what my parents told me I saw after we left the motel. One day, we drove to pick up my dad from his office building on base. It was late, and as I sat in the car, I pointed out a black man standing by the building. My mom looked around, but there was no one there. She was concerned and tried to hurry my dad along so we could leave quickly. The last time I'm told I saw him was at an old cemetery. My mom and I were walking around, looking at what I assume were Civil War graves, when I said, "Look, that black man just fell down." My mom looked around, but we were the only two there. I was between the ages of 3 and 6 during these encounters, and while I don't remember all the details of those later sightings, the image of the man in the motel closet has never left me. His face, just his head, staring down at me with that unsettling grin, is still burned into my memory. One strange detail is that my mom always found it odd how I described him as a black man, because as far as she knew, I hadn't met any black men at that age. It's also worth noting that Fort Huachuca, where my dad was stationed, has a long history. It was once a Buffalo Soldiers' barracks during the Civil War. I never saw anything like that again after we moved, but I often wonder if anyone else has had similar experiences in that area. Part of me would love to visit again, just to see if anything stirs up those old memories. Though I doubt I'd see him now, the memory of that smile still haunts me. A couple of years ago, on a cool autumn night, I had an experience that will stay with me forever. It all began when a group of friends and I decided to visit the local cemetery after hours. There were rumors that the place was haunted, and our curiosity got the best of us. We wanted to see if there was any truth to the stories. I was riding with a couple of friends in one car, while another friend drove separately. As we wound our way through the dark, narrow roads leading to the cemetery, a sense of unease settled over us. The night was still, almost unnervingly quiet, with only the soft rustling of leaves in the wind to keep us company. When we finally arrived at the cemetery, my heart began to race. The gates were locked, but that didn't stop us. We parked our cars outside and decided to explore on foot. The moon cast a dim, eerie glow over the gravestones, creating long, dancing shadows in the darkness. As we walked among the headstones, we read the names and dates etched into the cold, weathered stone. The air felt thick with tension, as though we weren't alone. Suddenly, my friend driving the other car gasped and pointed ahead. We all turned to look, and that's when we saw it. A small figure darted across the road in front of their truck. We froze in place, struggling to comprehend what we had just witnessed. A chill ran down my spine, goosebumps rising on my arms. Without a word, we quickly made our way back to the cars, eager to leave. As we drove down the dark road away from the cemetery, my friend in the other car suddenly slammed on the brakes. We pulled up beside them, rolling down the window to ask what had happened. They told us they had heard a loud bang on the back of their car, as if something or someone had hit it. We all got out to inspect the damage. What we found sent a wave of terror through us. Smeared across the back of their car were small handprints, as if a child had touched it. The realization hit us hard. The figure we had seen wasn't just our imagination. It was real. Fear gripped us as we stood there in the dark, unsure of what to do next. We could feel a presence watching us, a malevolent energy that sent shivers down our spines. Without another word, we hurried back into our cars and sped away from the cemetery. To this day, I still can't explain what we saw that night. Was it the spirit of a restless soul haunting the cemetery, or something far more sinister? Whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on me and my friends. We never spoke of that night again, too afraid to relive the terror we felt in the darkness of the cemetery. But the memory of that experience will stay with me forever. A chilling reminder of how thin the veil between the living and the dead can be.